Bantam Audio Publishing presents Dragonwing by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. Be at ease, Haplo. Come in and make yourself comfortable. Allow me to fill your glass, a salute to your long journey. To you, Haplo, my emissary to an unsuspecting world. And they must not suspect. I know we've been over this before, but I want to stress this again. The danger is great. If our ancient enemy, the Sartan, catches even the slightest hint that we patrons have escaped their prison, they will move land, sea, sun, and sky, as they did once, to thwart us. Sniff them out, as that dog of yours sniffs out a rat. But never let them catch a whiff of you. If they discover us before I am ready, we are lost. Death first, before you betray us. To the Sartan, they made us what we are. Centuries ago, the Sartan thought to defeat our ambition by sundering the world that was ours by rights and throwing us into their prison, the Labyrinth. It took us centuries to solve that twisting puzzle. The way out of the Labyrinth is long and torturous, as you well know. How vividly I remember how you emerged, bleeding, barely able to walk, dying. Yet you looked up to me with such triumph. You had escaped. The old books say the Sartan devised the Labyrinth hoping that our bounding ambition and our cruel and selfish natures would be softened by time and suffering. The Sartan had dared to assume that when we emerged into this world we would be fit to take our places in any of the four realms we chose to enter. Something went wrong. Perhaps you'll discover what it was when you entered Deathgate. It seems, from what I have been able to decipher in the old books, that the Sartan were to have monitored the Labyrinth. But either through malice, or for some other reason, they abandoned their responsibility as caretakers. When I found my way out at last, I discovered this beautiful land, the Nexus, that the Sartan had established for our occupation. And I came across the books. I read of the Sartan and their hopes for us, and I laughed aloud. I will laugh again when my plans are complete. When the four separate worlds, fire, water, stone, and sky, are again one. Yes, it's time for you to leave. You've been patient with the ramblings of your lord. To you, Haplo. As I was the first to leave the Labyrinth, so you shall be the first to enter Deathgate and walk the worlds beyond. The realm of sky. Study it well, Haplo. Come to know its people, their strengths and their weaknesses. But always be discreet. Keep your powers hidden. You have one other task. Bring me someone from this realm who will serve as my disciple. Someone who will preach the word, my word, to the people. It can be someone of any race, elven, human, dwarven. Make certain that he or she is intelligent, ambitious, and pliable. And now, a final salute to Deathgate. Prepare ye the way. Urendi Prison, Dandrak Isle, Mid-Realm. The crudely built cart lurched over the rough coralite of what passed for a road leading to the city of Calith. A prisoner was bound by taut leather thongs to the sides of the cart. Several sharp-eyed bowmen marched beside the cart, their feathered shafts ready to let loose straight at the felon's heart if he so much as twitched the wrong way. The man's appearance alone was enough to send a shiver over the skin. His hair and beard were black. The man was lean and sinewy, his movements graceful, silent, and swift. One might say, looking at him, that here was a man born and bred to walk in the company of night. It amused the prisoner to see the peasants on either side of the road fall back when he glanced around at them. He took to looking at them often, much to the discomfiture of the bowmen, who kept looking at their leader, a solemn-faced young sheriff, for instruction. Despite the chill of the evening, the sheriff was sweating profusely. His face brightened when the walls of Caelith came in sight. Guards pushed open the city gates and motioned the cart forward. A large crowd was on hand to view the prisoner. The people of the crowd, emboldened by their numbers, began to shout curses at him and raise their fists. The prisoner grinned boldly at them until a jagged-edged rock struck him in the forehead. The mocking smile vanished. Anger contorted the blood-streaked face. He clenched his fists, but his bonds made him powerless to act. Another rock struck him in the arm, followed by a stinking egg that missed the felon, but caught the sheriff squarely in the face. The bowmen now became the prisoner's protectors, but they were vastly outnumbered by the mob. Things appeared likely to go ill for both prisoner and guards when high-pitched screams were heard overhead. A gigantic black shape appeared in the sky. No one could see clearly in the gloom, but the flapping of huge wings was audible. Suddenly, a battle dragon swooped low over the gates of the city. A score of rope cables snaked down through the air. Men leaped from the dragon's back, slid down the cables, and landed in the courtyard. The silver insignia of the King's Own glittered on their panoplies. The crowd muttered ominously. Swiftly, the soldiers deployed, clearing a large area in the center of the courtyard and positioning themselves around it. A lone dragon rider flew over the gates. The small, swift-flying dragon hovered over the circle cleared for it and settled to the ground. Its rider's elegant livery, flashing red and gold, proclaimed him a king's courier. The people exchanged nervous looks. "I command you in the name of the king to deliver Hugh the Hand to me, alive," the courier shouted. It had only been a short time that the Volcaran Isles had known a king. Life was hard on these isles, and over the centuries they produced a hard people. Each isle was ruled by various clans. Each clan's lord spent his time either beating assaults off his own lands or attacking the lands of his neighbors on Ulandia. Thus divided, the humans were easy prey for another mid-realm country, the stronger, wealthier elven nation of Tribus. The elves gobbled the humans up piecemeal, and for almost 40 years the elves ruled both Ulandia and the Volcaran Isles. Their iron grip on the humans came to an end when a chieftain of the strongest clan of the Volcarans married the matriarch of the strongest clan in Ulandia. Rallying the humans, Stefan and Anne formed an army that overthrew the elves. When the Volcarans and Ulandia were free of occupation, Stefan and Anne proclaimed themselves king and queen, murdered their most dangerous rivals, and continued to be the most powerful and feared force in the realm. In the old days, the sheriff would have simply ignored the command, carried out the execution, and done away with the courier if the man proved obstinate. Now, unnerved by the massive presence of the battle dragon, the sheriff was reduced to quibbling. "Hugh the Hand is an assassin and the murderer of our lord, Rogar of Caelith," the sheriff said. "And it is the king's own law that we take his life in punishment. His Majesty regrets that he must interfere, but there is a royal warrant out for the arrest of this man. He is wanted for a matter which takes precedence over all local affairs." After the courier produced the warrant, the sheriff had no choice but to release the prisoner. Hugh the Hand was soon airborne on the back of the courier's dragon. Somewhere, Volcaran Isles, mid-realm. The courier kept his dragon under tight rein. Given its head, the small riding dragon could swiftly outfly the larger battle dragon. But the courier did not dare fly unescorted. Elven corsairs often lurked in the clouds, waiting to snap up lone human dragon riders, and so the going was slow. The courier glanced up and down, this way and that, like a man who had not flown much before, an odd thing for a king's courier. Floating far above, between Arianas and the sun, were the three Lords of Night, islands of Coralite, in the position where their orbit took them every 12 hours. All the floating isles of the realm of sky were composed of Coralite, the sponge-like excretion of a small, harmless, snake-shaped creature known as the coral grub. Coralite was as strong as granite when it hardened, though it could not be cut and polished. Coralite formed very fast. Structures made of the substance were not built so much as grown. Coral grubs gave off a gas that was lighter than air, which kept the isles suspended in the sky. Beneath the Lords of Night was the Isle of the High Realm, purportedly where lived the Mysteriarchs, powerful human wizards who had traveled there in voluntary exile from the Mid-Realm. Beneath the High Realm was the firmament or day's stars. No one knew precisely what the firmament was. Many believed it to be a band of precious jewels floating in the sky. Thus, legends of the fabulous wealth of the Mysteriarchs, who had supposedly passed through the firmament, evolved. Many attempts had been made by elves and humans to fly up to the firmament and discover its secrets, but those who tried it never returned. The air, it was said, was cold enough to freeze blood. The courier glanced back at his companion, curious to note the reactions of a man who had been snatched from death. But the assassin's face was impassive. Hugh was intently studying the route of their flight. They were flying high and fast, and there was not much to see beneath the shadows cast by the Lords of Night. But coralite gives off a faint bluish light, causing stands of forests to show up black against the silvery radiance of the ground. Landmarks were easy to locate. It must have been coincidence, but when the courier noted Hugh's interest in their flying route, a blanket of fog immediately began to drift over and obscure the land. Hugh knew the mist had not sprung up by chance, and his suspicion was confirmed. This young courier was no ordinary royal flunky. During the war, when marauding elven airships were in the skies, the people covered the shining coralite streets with straw. But there was no war upon the Volcaran Isles now. The majority of the humans who dwelt there thought fondly that this was due to their prowess in battle, the fear they had generated among the elf lords. The courier, considering this, shook his head in disgust at their ignorance. The elves of Tribus were ignoring the Volcarans and Ulandia because they were dealing with a much bigger problem, a rebellion among their own people. When that rebellion was ruthlessly crushed, the elves would again turn their attention to the humans. King Stefan knew that this time the elves would not be content with conquering and occupying, but would rid themselves forever of the human pollution in their world. Stefan was quietly and swiftly setting up his pieces on the great game board, preparing for the final bitter contest. The man sitting behind the courier didn't know it, but he was to be one of those pieces. At a gentle command from the courier, his dragon descended to the ground. They had landed, Hugh realized, in the courtyard of an ancient and long-abandoned monastery. The courier led him through a maze of silent corridors and spiral staircases till they came to a massive door, which the courier opened with an iron key. "Enter," the courier said. Hugh did as he was told. He was not surprised to hear the door shut behind him. No sound of the key turning in the lock, however. The only light in the room came from the soft glow of the coralite outside the window, which was light enough for Hugh's sharp eyes. He was, he discovered, not alone, but he felt no fear. Hugh was a businessman, and he recognized the setting of a business discussion when he saw it. "You are an expert. The best in the kingdom, I am told," said a man whose head and face were covered by chain mail, only the eyes visible. But Hugh knew to whom he was talking. Stefan, king of the Volcaran Isles and Ulandia. "You have a peculiar conceit, Hugh the Hand," said Stefan. "You advertise yourself as a hand of justice, of retribution. You kill those who allegedly have wronged others, those who are above the law, those whom, supposedly, my law cannot touch. Why do you do this?" "The money," Hugh answered. "Any knife-in-the-back killer can be had for the price of a plate of stew, and for this satisfaction they're willing to pay a high price." Stefan had turned and was staring out the window, his gloved hand, fist clenched, resting on the ledge. Hugh moved to the window and stood next to him. By the eerie blue light of the coralite, the assassin could see down into the small courtyard below, where stood a black hooded figure holding a sword. Twisting the ends of his beard, Hugh smiled. "So I'm to have no choice. I either accept this job you are about to offer me, or else my head parts company with my shoulders." I must take precautions, Stefan said coldly. I dare not permit you to remain alive, knowing what you will shortly know. What more do you expect? You are, after all, nothing but a murderer. And you, your majesty, are nothing more than a man who wants to hire a murderer. Bowing with an ironic flourish, Hugh turned on his heel. Where are you going? Stefan demanded. If your majesty will excuse me, I'm late for an engagement. I should have been in hell an hour previous. Hugh walked toward the door. Damn you, I've offered you your life. Hugh didn't even bother to turn around. The price is too low. My life's worth nothing to me. In exchange, you want me to accept a job so dangerous you've got to trap me to force me to take it? Better to meet death on my own terms. Hugh flung open the door. The king's courier stood facing him, blocking his way out. 10,000 barrels, said the courier. Is this necessary, Trian? Your majesty, he is the best, Trian advised. There is no one else to whom we can entrust this. Very well, the king snarled. 10,000 barrels. Hugh couldn't believe it. The barrel was the main standard of exchange in both elven and human lands. Half now, half when the job's done, Hugh demanded. Your life now, the barrels then, Stefan hissed. Hugh took a step toward the door. Half now, Stefan gasped. Hugh faced the king and bowed. Who's the victim? Stefan drew a deep breath and expelled it with a sound vaguely like a death's rattle. My son, said the king. Hugh was not surprised. With all the secrecy, it had to be somebody close to his majesty. We have told the prince, Stefan paused, trying to moisten a dry tongue. His life is in danger. He knows well enough that what we say is true. He believes you are a nobleman in disguise, hired to take him to a secret hiding place. The prince will not question you. With that, Stefan stalked past Hugh toward the door. He had apparently had enough. His nerve was failing him. There is a service I offer all my clients, Majesty. Stefan paused, hand on the door handle. Well, he did not look around. I tell the victim who is having him killed and why. Shall I so inform your son, Majesty? The chainmail jingled softly. A tremor shook the man's body, but Stefan's head remained unbowed, his shoulders straight. When the moment comes, he said, my son will know. The king walked into the corridor. Hugh heard his footsteps receding in the distance. There was no call to say that, said Trian quietly. You wounded him deeply. And who is this courier, returned Hugh, who worries about the king's feelings? You are right, Trian gave a wry smile. I am not a courier. I am the king's magus. And now, if you will accompany me, I have clothing and supplies for your journey, as well as the information you require. This way. Holding a glow lamp to light the way, Trian spoke as he led Hugh through the corridors. The prince must not suffer, Trian said. If that's what you want, Hugh grinned at him. You're the customer. That is what we want. Reassured, Trian walked only a short distance further, then stopped before a door. He placed the glow lamp on the floor and motioned Hugh to look through the keyhole. Stooping, the assassin peered into the room. Hugh rarely felt emotion of any sort, never showed it. In this instance, however, his disinterested glance through the keyhole at his intended victim sharpened to an intense stare. Curled up on a pallet, fast asleep, was a wistful-faced child who could not have been older than 10. Hugh slowly straightened. I'd be interested to know what a kid that age could have done to earn an early death, he said dryly. Trian flushed. You are being paid well enough not to ask questions. In fact, here is your money. Fumbling in a purse that hung at his side, Trian produced a handful of coins and counted out 50 100 pieces. Hugh accepted the money. Its value was exchangeable in the precious commodity, water. An equivalent exchange for a barrel of water is 1 barrel. Water was scarce in the mid-realm. Rain fell infrequently, and when it did fall was immediately soaked up and retained by the porous corallite. No rivers or streams ran through the corallite isles. Humans in the mid-realm obtained water by cultivating plants that trapped the precious liquid, but the process was expensive. There was an abundance of water below in the low realm, those isles in the heart of a perpetual storm known as the Maelstrom. But no dragon had yet been found that would fly into the Maelstrom. The elves, with their magical, mechanical dragon ships, were able to sail the storm-tossed route, and consequently held a virtual monopoly on water. They charged exorbitant prices for it. This job would make Hugh's fortune. He would never have to work again if he chose. And all for killing one little kid. But it didn't make sense. Hugh balanced the coins in his hand and stood looking at the wizard. "Very well, I suppose you must know something," Trian admitted reluctantly. "It is no secret that Stefan's marriage to Anne is strictly one of convenience, to keep their two powerful nations from going for each other's throats and leaving us at the mercy of the elves. The lady would like very much, however, to have power consolidated in her hands. The crown of the Volcarans cannot be passed on to a female, and the only way Anne can take control is through her son. We recently discovered her plot. My king barely escaped with his life this time."
"And so you get rid of the kid. That solves your problem, I guess, but leaves your king without an heir."
"Stefan is not a fool," Trian replied. "During the war that is soon to be declared against the elves, Stefan will divorce Anne and marry a woman of Volcaran. The war will force the nations to remain united despite the divorce. By the time peace comes, if ever, Ulandia will be too weakened, too dependent on Stefan to break the ties."
"Very clever," Hugh conceded. "And what'll make the elves go to war? They have the rebellion on their hands."
"The cause of the war will be the death of the prince."
"Ah," Hugh said. "All very neat and tidy. That's why you must trust the deed to me."
"Yes," Trian's voice broke. "The child's body must be found by our people on the elven stronghold, the continent of Aristagon. I will provide you with a list of locations. We understand you have a dragon ship."
"Of elven make and design. Isn't that convenient?" Hugh responded. "You had this well thought out, didn't you? Even to the point of framing me for the murder of Lord Drogar of Caelith."
"Yes," Trian said. "Your dagger was appropriated and substituted for the one in the body."
"How will I contact you for the rest of my pay, and what assurance do I have that I'll get my pay and not a feathered shaft in my ribs when I return?"
"Oh, you have our word, the word of the king."
Hugh smiled. "The word of a man who hires me to murder his child."
The young wizard flushed in anger. "Do not judge him. You cannot understand." He silenced himself. Hugh realized that no more information would be forthcoming.
"What token shall I send you? An ear, a finger, what?"
"Blessed ancestors forfend!" The young wizard turned deathly white. He swayed unsteadily on his feet. "The prince wears—" Trian gulped and then suddenly seemed to find some inner reserve of strength. "An amulet. The feather of a hawk. Due to its magical properties, the amulet cannot be removed unless the prince is dead. Send us this amulet, and we will know."
"What magic?" Hugh asked suspiciously.
The wizard shook his head. Whether physically unable to speak or refusing to answer, Hugh couldn't tell. It was obvious he wasn't going to find out any more about the prince or his amulet, which probably had about as much magic in it as the stone beneath Hugh's feet. Trian collected himself, color returning to his cheeks. "I am ready now," he said. He unlocked the door. "Farewell," he said, tucking the key into the breast of his doublet.
"Aren't you coming in to explain?"
"No," he said softly. "It is now in your hands. I'll leave you the lamp and your belongings." The wizard pointed to the floor where lay a pack and a sword. Then he fled down the corridor and was soon lost in the shadows. The assassin entered the chamber. Holding the lamp high, Hugh shone it on the boy. He cared nothing for children. Gazing down at the sleeping face of the young child, he felt no pity, no outrage.
Hugh knew the wizard had been lying. Now he only had to figure out why. The assassin nudged the child. "Kid, wake up." The boy's eyes flared open, and he sat up. "What is it?" he asked sleepily, staring through a mass of tousled golden curls at the stranger standing above him. "Who are you?" "I'm known as Sir Hugh, your highness," said Hugh, remembering in time that he was supposed to be a nobleman. "Get up. Time is short." Hugh was somewhat surprised that the child simply replied, "I will accompany you. Bring my things." The boy waved a small hand at a pack lying beside his pallet. Hugh almost told the kid to bring his own things. Instead, he said humbly, "Yes, your highness," and took up the pack. He took a close look at the child. The prince was small for his age, with large, pale blue eyes, milky white skin, and a sweetly curved mouth. The light glistened off a hawk feather hanging from a silver chain around his neck. "Since we are to be traveling companions, you may call me by my name," said the boy. "I am Prince Bane." Hugh froze. Bane? The assassin wasn't superstitious, but why would anyone give a child such an ill-omened name? Hugh felt fate's web tighten around his neck. Het, Drevlin, Low Realm. On the night that Lord Rogar of Calith was murdered, thousands of miles below on the Isle of Drevlin, Limbeck Bolt-Tightener was seated in his cozy, untidy dwelling in Het, the oldest city on Drevlin, composing a speech. Limbeck was, in his own language, a Geg. In another language, or in the ancient world before the Sundering, he would have been known as a dwarf. He stood a respectable 4 feet in height. A full and luxuriant growth of beard adorned a cheerful open face. He was developing a slight paunch, unusual in a hard-working young adult Geg, due to the fact that he sat a great deal. Limbeck's eyes were bright, inquisitive, and extremely nearsighted. Without his spectacles, he was blind. He lived in a small cavern amid hundreds of other caverns that honeycombed a large mound of corallite located on the outskirts of Het. Limbeck's cave was different in certain respects from those of his neighbors, which seemed fitting since Limbeck himself was certainly an unusual Geg. His cave had windows. Most Gegs didn't need windows. The storms that buffeted Drevlin made windows impractical, and in general, the Gegs were far more concerned with what was going on inside than out. Limbeck liked looking without, even if he only looked out on slashing rain, hail, and lightning. One other feature of Limbeck's dwelling made it positively unique. On the front door was a sign with the letters WUPP. In all other aspects, the dwelling was a typical Geg dwelling. The furniture was functional, and there was no frivolous decorations, because none would stay put. The walls and floors of the snug cavern shook and quivered with the thumping, throbbing, whooping, zitz, crackle, and clanging of the Kixie-Winzy, the dominant feature, the dominant force on Drevlin. Limbeck, the august leader of WUP, did not mind the noise. All Gegs revered the noise, just as they revered the Kixie-Winzy. They knew that if the noise ceased, their world would come to an end. Death was known among the Gegs as the endless hear-nothing. Wrapped in the comforting banging and drumming, Limbeck struggled with his speech. He tried out the words aloud as he wrote. "It is therefore our purpose as WUPs, worshippers united for progress and prosperity, to bring to our people a time of good living now, not some time in a future that may never come." Limbeck, carried away, banged his fist on the table. "For centuries we have been told by our leaders that we were placed in this realm of storm and chaos because we were not deemed worthy to reside with the elves above. When we are worthy, our leaders tell us, then the elves will come from above and pass judgment on us, and we shall rise up into the heavens. In the meantime, it is our duty to serve the Kixie-Winzy and wait for that great day. I say that day will never come. I say that we have been lied to. It is easy enough for the High Froman to talk of waiting for change until judgment comes. Our Geg leaders do not need a better life. They receive the elves' payment. But do they disperse it equally among us? No!" Over the din of the Kixie-Winzy, Limbeck's keen ears picked up a distant shouting. He groaned. He was late for the WUP rally. But just as he headed out the door, the next line of his speech occurred to him, and he sat back down to write. We WAPs advocate 3 tenets. The first, Gegs should pool their knowledge of the Kixie-Winzy and learn how the machine as a whole operates so that we may become its masters, not its slaves. The second, we should quit waiting for a day of judgment and start to work now for better quality of our lives. The third, worshippers should go to the High Foreman and demand a fair share in the whelp's payment. Limbeck sighed. He knew from past experience that his third tenet would be the most popular with the young Gegs, impatient over serving long hours for inadequate pay. But of the 3, Limbeck himself knew it would be the least important. If only they had seen what I saw, Limbeck mourned. If only they knew what I know. If only I could tell them. In his youth, not so long ago, Limbeck had wandered outside and discovered a secret that he had never told anyone. No one ever went outside and left the comforting presence of the Kixie-Winzy. Rife with tunnels and covered walkways and underground passages, the cities and towns of Drevlin were constructed so that a Geg could go for months without ever feeling a raindrop splash on his face. Limbeck braved the terrors of outside because they were far more attractive than the wrath his father would unleash when he learned that Limbeck had asked his teacher why the Kixie-Winzy existed and had been kicked out of school. Gegs never questioned anything. They were skilled and dexterous, but unimaginative. Each Geg knew how to serve his or her particular part of the Kixie-Winzy and had no interest in any other part. Why the whirly-wheel had to be turned, why the pull-arm needed to be pulled, the push-arm pushed, or the clankety-crank cranked, were questions that did not occur to the average Geg. Moreover, delving into the whys and wherefores of the great Kixie-Winzy was blasphemous, and would call down the judgment of the clerks, the ecclesiastical force on Drevlin. Performing his or her act of worship as taught by the teachers, and doing it well enough to gain a place in heaven, was the height of ambition for most Gegs. But not Limbeck. He was not an average Geg. The sound of distant shouting again broke into his thoughts. Limbeck smiled with fond pride. His wife, Jarre, was speaking, and she was having her usual effect. She doesn't need me, Limbeck reflected proudly. She's doing fine without me. I'll just go ahead and finish. Limbeck returned to his writing. Suddenly the door banged open, startling him immensely. Is that you, my dear? He said, as a dark and shapeless blur that he assumed was Jarre came towards him. Jarre pounced on him. Come on, we've got to get you out of here. The coppers are coming. She began to push and hustle Limbeck along. I'm not going anywhere, my dear, until you tell me what's happened. Limbeck calmly adjusted his spectacles. Oh, very well, she said with exasperation, keeping her eyes on the front door. The crowd at the rally attacked the Kixie-Winzy tonight. No! Limbeck was so shaken by this news that he sat down. The coppers will be coming after you, my dear. Listen! Someone was hammering on the front door. Limbeck, punishment for hurting the Kixie-Winzy is death. Limbeck brushed this aside as a minor consideration. My dear, said Limbeck with a look of almost holy radiance, at last I'll have the audience I've sought all my life. This is our golden opportunity. Just think, I'll be able to present our cause to the High Foreman. The blade of a chop cutter smashed through the wooden door. Jarre turned pale. Oh, Limbeck, this is no time to play martyr. You go ahead, my dear, said Limbeck, kissing her on the forehead. I'll stay. Then I'll stay too, Jarre said fiercely, entwining her hand around his. No, no, Limbeck shook his head. You must carry on in my absence. When my words and my example inflame the worshippers, you must be there to lead the revolution. Then I'll go, but we'll spring you. Jarre hastened to the back door, but could not forbear pausing for one final glance behind her. Be careful. Blowing him a kiss, she disappeared just as the coppers crashed through the front door. We're looking for one Limbeck bolt-tightener, said a copper whose dignity was somewhat marred by the fact that he was plucking splinters from the door out of his beard. You have found him, said Limbeck majestically. Thrusting out his hands, wrists together, he continued. Take me to your foul-smelling, rat-infested dungeon." "Foul-smelling?" The copper was highly incensed. "I'll have you know we clean our jail regular, and as for rats, there ain't been one seen there in 20 years, ever since we brought in that cat. You've no call to go insulting my jail." I'm very sorry," Limbeck stammered. I had no idea." "Now, come along with you," said the copper. "Why are you sticking your hands in my face?" "Aren't you going to shackle me? Bind me hand and foot?" "And how would you walk? I suppose you expect us to carry you." The copper sniffed. Limbeck allowed himself to be led away to a prosaic cat-patrolled prison. Martyrdom was not starting out well. The High Froman was head of the most important script in all Drevlin. At least, that was how his clan viewed themselves. Every Gaig belonged to a script, a clan that had lived in the same city and had worshipped the same part of the Kixie-Wincy since the Gaigs had been brought to the Low Realm by the gods they called the Mangers. The High Froman script was in charge of the Lift Aloft, a hallowed altar where once a month the Welves descended from the heavens in their dragon ships and accepted holy water from the Gaigs. The High Froman held court inside a building known as the Factory in Drevlin's capital city of Wombe. A huge structure, the Factory was the site of the Gaigs' most sacred icon, the brass statue of a tall, hooded figure that the Gaigs believed to be a Manger. In one of its hands, the Manger grasped a huge, staring eyeball. A whistle-toot, blowing 3 times, called for relative silence. That is, the Gaigs kept quiet, the Kixie-Wincy didn't. When the High Froman made his appearance, the ceremony of Justic commenced. High Froman Darrell Longshoreman was dressed in ordinary work clothes, incongruously topped by a crown of cast iron, a gift from the Kixie-Wincy, which was the High Froman's pride, despite the fact that it gave him a pounding headache. Once he was wedged into the sit-up high, an extremely uncomfortable ceremonial chair. The High Froman gestured for the prisoner to be led forward. The High Froman hoped, for the sake of his squeezed posterior and his already aching head, that the trial would be a short one. A young Gaig, carrying a large sheaf of papers, stepped respectfully into the presence of the High Froman, who roared, "Where's the prisoner? What's the delay?" "Begging the foreman's pardon, but I'm the prisoner, and I'm my own voice, your honor," said Limbeck modestly. "Where's the voice of the offense?" the Froman snorted. "I have the honor of being the offensive voice, your honor," said a female Gaig. "Is this sort of thing," the Froman waved a hand at Limbeck, "done?" "To be honest, your honor, we couldn't find anyone willing to defend the prisoner," the offense said. "Ah!" The High Froman felt immensely cheered. It was likely to be a very short trial. "Well, then, carry on." The voice of the offense called the High Froman's attention to the male Gaig seated beside her. "The head clerk will be representing the church in this matter, your honor," she said. The head clerk stood up and bowed with dignity. The High Froman said, "Accused, you may speak in your own defense. But take care, young man, I'll tolerate no blasphemous harangues in this court." After a moment of profound deliberation, Limbeck laid the sheaf of papers down on an iron drum and removed his spectacles. "Your honor," said Limbeck with deep respect, "I have never told this to anyone before. Not my parents, not even the person I hold most dear in all the world. It happened the day I was thrown out of school. I had to get away. There weren't any fierce storms in the area just then, and I thought I'd take a little look around outside, to sort of distract myself from my trouble. I guess I was concentrating on keeping my footing, because suddenly a storm struck. I needed shelter, and through the rain made out a large object lying on the ground, so I ran for it." "You can imagine my surprise, your honor," said Limbeck, "when I discovered that it was one of the Welves' dragon ships." The words echoed in the factory. The Gaig stirred and muttered. "On the ground? Impossible! The Welves never landed on Drevlin." The head clerk was pious and smug. Limbeck explained. The ship had crashed. This created a sensation in the court. The head clerk leapt to his feet. I demand that this travesty of justice stop, boomed the head clerk. The High Froman considered doing just that. Ending the trial would accomplish 3 things. It would rid him of this mad gag, end his headache, and restore the circulation to his lower extremities. Unfortunately, however, it would appear to his constituents as if he had caved into the church. No, better let this Limbeck fellow go ahead and hang himself. Proceed, said the High Froman, glaring at the crowd and the head clerk. There was nowhere to go for shelter except inside the ship. So I entered and found the Welves dead. Shouts of outrage, cries of alarm, and a muffled cheer rang through the factory. The head clerk fell back into his seat, stricken. The High Froman managed to wedge himself inextricably in his chair. Unable to rise to his feet to restore order, he could only wriggle and fume. Listen to me, Limbeck cried. These Welves from the realms above are not gods, as they would have us believe. They are not immortal, but are made of flesh like ourselves. I know, because I saw that flesh rotting away. Chaos broke out. Gags were yelling and shoving. Appalled at the monster he'd unwittingly unleashed, the High Froman, finally freed from his chair, stomped his feet and shouted, Clear the court! Clear the court! Coppers charged in, but it was some time before they could make the excited Gags leave the factory. Finally, the High Froman, the head clerk, the offensive voice, Limbeck, and the 2 warders were left alone in the factory. You are a dangerous young man, said the High Froman, and tomorrow morning you will be made to walk the steps of Terrell Finn. May the Mangers have mercy on your soul. Limping, one hand rubbing his numb backside and the other his pounding head, Darrell Longshoreman stalked out of the factory. Later that day, Jari went to see Limbeck in the Drevlin jail. They met in the visitors' room. Limbeck had left his spectacles in his cell, so Jari's face was pretty much a blur to him. He had the feeling that she was troubled, perhaps by his impending execution, but Jari tended to take things like that in stride. This was something much deeper. How's the Union getting along? Limbeck asked. Oh, Limbeck, Jari complained sadly. Why did you have to go and tell those ridiculous stories during the trial? What stories? Limbeck's bushy eyebrows shot up into the roots of his curly hair. You know, the ones about the Welves being dead. All those things really happened. It was the knowledge that these Welves are mortal just like us that inspired me to start our union. Now listen to me, Jari snapped. We don't have much time. The most important thing we've got going for us right now is this execution of yours. Don't mess it up. Don't, she raised a warning finger, say anything more about dead Welves. Limbeck sighed. I won't, he promised. You're a martyr for the cause. Don't forget that. At least try to look martyred. I'm not sure how. Oh, you know, brave, dignified, defiant, forgiving. Forgiving, muttered Limbeck, committing it to memory. And give a final defiant shout when they shove you off the edge. Something about what forever, and you returning, of course. Am I? Returning? Limbeck peered at her myopically. You didn't think we'd let them execute you, did you? Well, You're such a drusk, Jari said, playfully ruffling his hair. Now they'll strap you to this thing called a lightning bird, which consists of 2 giant wings made out of wood and feathers with a cable attached. Then they'll shove you off above the steps of Terrell Finn. You float around in the storm. But with my weight on it, won't it sink? Will you stop interrupting me? Yes, said Limbeck meekly. The contraption will begin to fall, snapping the cable, and you will eventually crash. I will? Limbeck was pale. But don't worry. You'll land in one piece on one of the isles of the Terrell Fen that are being mined by the Kixie-Winsey. When the dig claws come down to dig up the ore, you must put a mark on one of them. Our people will be watching for it, and when the dig claw comes back up, we'll see your mark and know which island you're on. That's a very good plan, my dear. Limbeck smiled at her in admiration. Thank you. Jari flushed with pleasure. The next time the Digclaws come down, we'll make certain that a help hand is lowered. We'll bring you up, we'll put it out that you were judged innocent by the Mangers, and that therefore they support our cause. We'll have Gegs flocking to join us. The day of the revolution will dawn. Jari's eyes gleamed. The Gegs were a very gentle and good-natured people. Taking another Geg's life was unheard of, undreamt of. Only the Kixie-Winsie had the right to kill a Geg, and that was generally by accident. And although the Gegs had execution down on their law books, they couldn't ever bring themselves to actually put one of their fellows to death. Therefore, they dumped execution in the lap of the Mangers, who weren't around to protest. If the Mangers wanted the condemned to live, they'd see to it that he lived. If they didn't, he didn't. And the High Froman hoped the Mangers would keep Limbeck, as he watched 6 stout clerks grasp the lightning bird with Limbeck attached and hoist it up over their heads. At the signal from the head clerk, they broke into a lumbering run, dashed down a ramp, heading for the edge of the Isle of Drevlin, beneath which the series of small floating islands known as the Terrell Fen revolved downward into the all-dark. At just the right moment, the wind lifted the lightning bird into the air, and as Limbeck sailed gracefully away, the High Froman could have sworn that he heard one last "Why?" Somewhere, Ulandia, mid-realm. On the morning Limbeck was gliding downward into the Terrell Fen, Hugh and Prince Bane were flying dragonback somewhere over Ulandia. The flight was cold and cheerless. Trian had given the dragon its directions, so that Hugh had nothing to do but sit in the saddle. Someone was following them. Whoever it was, he was good at it too. Hugh searched the sky but saw nothing. Instinct alone, reacting to a sound, a smell, something glimpsed from the corner of the eye, told him they had company. His one thought was, who was trailing them, and why? Someone sent by the Queen, no doubt. Hugh cursed the wizard and his king long and hard beneath his breath. The bungling fools had let slip their plans. Now, undoubtedly, Hugh would have to contend with someone attempting to rescue the child. Hugh would have to rid himself of this nuisance, which meant laying a trap, cutting a throat, hiding a body. Well, it'll cost them, thought Hugh grimly as the dragon began circling down. He guessed that they had reached their destination. With the aid of a sextant he found in his pack, Hugh determined that they had been set down on an island called Pitrin's Exile, a day's journey on foot away from the place where Hugh's dragon ship was hidden. Hugh and the boy set off toward the vessel. They had not gone far when they came upon a deserted shed, where Hugh decided to spend what little remained of the night. In the manner of a man bone-tired from a long journey, Hugh, shoulders slumped, marched the prince into the shed. The assassin gave the door a push to close it. It didn't shut all the way, but he was, apparently, too tired to notice. Bane took a blanket from his pack, spread it, and lay down. Hugh did the same, shutting his eyes. When he heard the child's breathing fall into the rhythm of sleep, Hugh slipped off his tall boots and laid them on the floor, carefully arranging them, along with his other belongings, and covering all with a blanket so that anyone looking in from the door could see the feet of a blanket-wrapped man, presumably fast asleep. Satisfied, Hugh took his sword in hand and crept into a dark corner of the shed where he waited. It wouldn't be long now. Day had dawned fully. The man who had been following them must fear they would waken and start on their way again. The assassin watched the thin ribbon of gray light streaming in through the partially shut door. When that ribbon began to widen, Hugh's hand tightened its grip on his sword. Slowly, silently, the door swung open. A head was thrust inside. The man looked long and carefully at the figure beneath the blanket, then turned the same careful scrutiny to the boy. Hugh held his breath. The man entered the shed. The assassin was disconcerted to see that the man carried no weapon in his hand. Hugh leapt and wrapped an arm around the man's neck. "Who sent you? Tell me the truth and I'll reward you with a quick death."
body in Hugh's grasp went limp. The man had fainted.
"Not exactly the sort of person I'd send to rescue my son from the hands of an assassin," muttered Hugh,
stretching out the unconscious man on the floor of the shed. The man's age was indeterminable, although his face was careworn and he had a bald spot on the top of his head. Tall and gangly, he appeared to have been put together by someone who had run out of the correct parts and been forced to substitute. The commotion had woken Prince Bane, who came to Hugh's side. "Why, that's Alfred!" The boy grasped hold of the man's cape and shook him. "Alfred! Wake up! Wake up!" Opening his eyes, Alfred stared dazedly at the prince. "We thought you were an assassin!" The prince nearly smothered the man with a hug. Sitting up, Alfred gave Hugh, and particularly Hugh's sword, a nervous glance.
"Who are you?"
Hugh demanded. The man answered humbly, "Sir, my name—" "He's Alfred," interrupted Bane, as if that explained everything. Noting from Hugh's grim face that it didn't, the boy added, "He makes certain my bath water's not too hot."
"You're the one who's been following us?"
Hugh said. "I'm the prince's chamberlain. It is my duty to be with his highness, sir." "This is Sir Hugh," Bane introduced them. Hugh snorted, rose to his feet, and began to roll up his blanket. "Please, Sir Hugh, allow me." Leaping up, Alfred sprang to snatch the blanket from Hugh's hand, but stumbled and would have pitched head first into the assassin had he not shoved him upright. "Oh, thank you, sir. I'm very clumsy, I'm afraid. Here, I can do that now." Alfred began struggling with the blanket. Hugh glanced over at Bane.
"Don't wander off, your highness,"
he said, noticing the prince was about to skip out the door. "I just want to look around outside," said the boy. "I won't go far. I'll be careful." Once Bane was gone, Alfred turned to Hugh. "You will allow me to accompany you, won't you, sir? I won't be any trouble, I swear." Hugh stared at him intently.
"I'm taking you with me to look after the kid. It would be my duty to stop you before you did anything foolish like trying to sneak him away."
"Yes, sir, that's understood." Alfred returned Hugh's gaze. "You see, sir, I know the reason the king hired you."
"You know about the plot against the prince's life?"
Hugh questioned, his hand beneath his cloak moving to his sword. "I know the reason," repeated Alfred. "That is why I am here. I won't get in the way, sir. I promise you." Hugh was confounded.
"The man knew the reason," he said. "It sounded as if he meant the real reason. Has he come to help or to hinder? Help? That was almost laughable. This chamberlain couldn't dress himself without help."
Yet Hugh had to admit, Alfred had done an extremely efficient job of tailing them. Whether Alfred was truly the fool he appeared, or a cunning liar, the man had his uses, not the least of which would be to take charge of his highness.
"All right. Let's get started," Hugh said.
Steps of Terrell Fen, Low Realm. Rain pelted the wings of Limbeck's lightning bird, causing it to disintegrate. As he fell toward one of the islands of Terrell Fen, Limbeck made the discovery of the law of gravity. The crash, however, drove the thought clean out of his head. On regaining consciousness, it took him, in his confused state, a considerable amount of time to determine that he was suspended over a pit, the wooden frame of his giant wings having straddled it neatly, leaving him dangling below. Limbeck was wondering just how he was going to free himself when the answer came to him rather unpleasantly in the form of a sharp crack. He had just time enough to experience overwhelming terror before he landed painfully at the bottom of the pit, the wings crashing down all around him. He extricated himself from the mess and peered upward. The pit was only about 7 or 8 feet deep, and it offered shelter from the storm. He decided he was in no danger until there was a large thump, and the pit shuddered. "Dig claws," thought Limbeck, and he started up the side of the pit, the coralite offering a good climbing surface. Glancing upward, Limbeck could see other claws dropping out of the sky, descending on long cables lowered from the Kixie Winzy. It was an awesome spectacle, and when he got to the top of the pit, the Geg stood staring, his mouth agape. Made of bright and shining metal, ornately carved and fashioned to resemble the foot of some huge killer bird, the dig claws dug into the coralite with their sharp talons. Closing over the broken rock, the claws were starting to rise back up, when Limbeck remembered he was supposed to put a mark on one of them to let Jari and her people know where he was. A few minutes later, Limbeck threw away his makeshift engraving tool, a piece of coralite, and gazed proudly on his work. One dig claw, rising into the stormy sky, was marked with the letter L. Dashing through the rain, Limbeck returned to his pit. He climbed back down the sides, and reaching the bottom, made himself as comfortable as possible. Pulling a piece of torn wing fabric over his head, he tried not to think about food. Within minutes, a bone-jarring thud jolted Limbeck out of his despair. Flustered, he staggered to his feet and stared up into the grayness. The storm had passed, leaving behind only fog and drizzle. Limbeck hurriedly started up the sides of the pit. His spirits were rising. He had a why to investigate. Reaching the rim of the pit, he peeped cautiously over the edge. He gasped, marveling. A brilliant light, shimmering with more colors than Limbeck had ever imagined existed in his metallic world, was streaming out of a gigantic hole not more than 30 feet from him. Without stopping to consider that it might be dangerous to investigate, Limbeck clambered up over the edge of the pit and made for the light as swiftly as his short legs would carry him. Intent on the light, Limbeck stumbled almost blindly over the rocky ground and fell flat on his face at the hole's edge. He pulled himself over the lip of the hole and saw the light's source. It was beaming out of an object at the bottom of the hole. "That was what made the thump," said Limbeck, shielding his eyes with the hand and squinting at the object. "It fell from the sky like I did. Is it part of the Kixie-Winsie? If so, why did it fall?" Why? Limbeck couldn't stand not knowing. He crawled over the edge of the hole and slid down one of its slanted sides. The metal object was about 4 times taller than he was, and as big as his house. Gingerly, he reached out and swiftly tapped the metal. It wasn't hot to the touch. An ominous creaking noise sounded above him, and part of his brain was shrieking at him something about dig claws coming down. Nonetheless, Limbeck started to tug at the place where the object had cracked. The crack widened, and he heard a sound like a groan. Wishing angrily that the distracting creaking sounds of the dig claws would cease, Limbeck listened intently. He heard the groan again. There was something alive inside the metal shell, and it was hurt. Limbeck put his hands on either side of the crack and pushed with all his might. Though they bit into his flesh, the metal sides split wide open, and the Geg was able to squeeze inside. The light had been brilliant outside the object. Inside it was blinding. With his eyes almost completely shut, Limbeck searched for whatever it was that was in pain. Limbeck's heart jumped. "A whelp!" he cried out in excitement. "And a live one at that!" Squatting down beside the wounded being, the Geg saw that it wasn't a whelp. Limbeck had seen a human only once before, in pictures in the Whelp books. This creature looked a little like a human, but with its great height and thin muscular body it was definitely one of the so-called gods. The god who wasn't's face was rough cut, a square, cleft chin, and lips tightly drawn, appearing to guard secrets. A few fine lines around the eyes seemed to indicate that the god was no youngster. At that moment, the screaming warnings in Limbeck's brain became so insistent that he was forced to pay attention to them. He looked up through the crack in the ship's structure into the wide-open maw of a dig claw directly above him and descending rapidly. If Limbeck hurried, he could escape the ship before the claw smashed into it. "I've got to get you out of here," Limbeck said to the god. Grasping the god by the wrists, Limbeck started to pull him across the debris-strewn floor of the shattered ship, when he felt, with a shiver, hands returning his grasp. Startled, he looked down at the god. The lips moved. "My dog." The Geg glanced hastily around the wreckage and suddenly saw, right at the god's feet, an animal pinned and squirming beneath the twisted metal. Limbeck wondered why he hadn't seen it before, It was stuck and couldn't free itself. The Gag looked from the claw to the god to the dog. "I'm sorry," he said helplessly. "There just isn't time." The dog, looking at its master, whimpered and increased its efforts to free itself as the Gag pulled the body of the god across the debris-strewn floor. The dog's struggles became frantic, its whimperings changing to yelps. A lump rising in his throat that was both pity for the trapped animal and fear for himself, Limbeck heaved and pulled and finally reached the crack. With a great effort he dragged the god through. Depositing the limp body on the floor of the crater, Limbeck threw himself down beside the god just as the Digclaw smashed into the metal ship. There was a shattering explosion. Small bits of shattered steel fell down around him like rain, the sharp edges biting painfully into his skin. When that ceased, all was quiet. Slowly, dazedly, Limbeck lifted his head, expecting to see the twisted wreckage of the ship. Instead, it had vanished as though it had never been. Limbeck stared at the place where the ship had been. There was the dog! The dog hobbled over to its unconscious master, its eyes shining brightly, its mouth open in what looked like a pleased grin. The dog gave its master's hand a lick. Just then, Limbeck looked up and saw the help hand that had been sent for him lowering to the ground by his original pit 30 feet away. His first thought was to hurry, for the Digclaws were about to rise again. Staggering to his feet, he moved to the god who wasn't. The thought of dragging the god's heavy body up out of the crater and across the cracked and pitted landscape made Limbeck's heart sink. "I can't do it," he muttered, collapsing next to the god. "I don't think I can even make it back myself." "But this god who isn't will prove you were right," nagged an irritating voice in his brain. "This could start the revolution." The revolution! Limbeck closed his eyes. He was back on Drevlin. The Gags were cheering him. What was even more beautiful, they were doing as he advised. They were asking why. Afterward, Limbeck could never clearly recall the next harrowing span of time. He remembered that the dog stood aside as he began hauling the limp body of the god up the side of the crater. He remembered nothing else, but dragging himself and the body a few feet, then collapsing, then struggling on again. A storm broke, and he knew that they could not hope to survive its full fury out in the open. The wind kept him flattened to the ground, not that Limbeck had the strength to stand. He was about to give up when he noticed blearily that he was close to the help hand. Hope lent the Gag strength. He made it to his feet. Buffeted by wind, he nevertheless managed to drag the god the last few remaining feet. Limbeck opened the door to the glass bubble. 2 stout Gags could fit comfortably inside the glass bubble. The god, being considerably taller than a Gag, presented a problem. Limbeck dragged the god over to the bubble and thrust him inside. He tucked the god's legs up so that the god's knees rested against his chin, and he folded the god's arms over his chest. Limbeck climbed in himself, and the dog jumped in afterwards. It was a tight fit, but Limbeck wasn't about to leave the dog behind. Not again. He didn't think he could stand the shock of seeing it come back from the dead a second time. Limbeck struggled against the roaring wind to shut the glass door. The help hand rocked in the storm. Limbeck had visions of it snapping off the cable, and suddenly he wanted only one thing, to get off the island. He reached over and grasped the communication horn. Drawing a lungful of air, Limbeck concentrated all of his waning strength. "Up!" he yelled. Slowly, with an alarming creaking sound, swinging back and forth in the gale winds, the help hand began to rise. Trying not to think what would happen now if the cable snapped, Limbeck closed his eyes and hoped he wouldn't be sick. "It's him! It's Limbeck!" exclaimed Jarre, seeing a blurry blob through the rain streaming off the glass bubble as it sat on the rumble floor of the Kixie-Winzy. Jarre rushed to the help hand, the other Gags hastening after her. Reaching the door, she yanked on it impatiently. There came from inside a loud and unfriendly-sounding woof. The other Gags backed away from the bubble. Tips of fingers could be seen waggling from the door. The Gags glanced at each other apprehensively and took another step back. Jarre looked at each Gag in turn for help.
Each Geg, in turn, looked at the Winder-Upper or the Munching Chopper or the Rumble Floor, anywhere but at the bubble that had woofed. "Hey, help me get out of this thing!" yelled Limbeck. Jarre inspected the hand emerging from the door. It looked like Limbeck's hand. She grasped hold of the door somewhat tentatively and tugged. Face flushed and sweating, Limbeck appeared. "Hello, my dear," said Limbeck, shaking hands with Jarre, too distracted to notice that she had held her face up to be kissed. Stepping out of the bubble, he said triumphantly, "I've brought back a god!" The Gegs stared at him with amazement and suspicion. "Here, help me get him out. He's hurt," Limbeck ordered. "How can a god be hurt?" demanded one of the Gegs. "Aha!" shouted Limbeck. "That's my point." 10 minutes later the Gegs had hidden the dog and his master in an ore cart and were pushing it to the nearest exit. No one stopped them. No one demanded to know why they were shoving an ore cart through the tunnels. Limbeck, sighing, shook his head and pronounced this lack of curiosity a sad commentary on his people. Haplo floated to consciousness again. He could hear voices, but they came from the other room. He was alone. Tugging at the cloth that, unnoticed by his rescuers, covered his left hand, he exposed the hand with its tattoos. Each red and blue whorl and whorl was a sigil, the basic unit of the rune language employed only by the patron and the Sartan, although the Sartan's language was slightly different. Haplo raised his arm and pressed the back of his hand upon the gash on his forehead. Warmth streamed from his hand to his head. Sleep would follow, pain would ease, and he would heal. Haplo rearranged the cloth to cover his hand. As he fell asleep, he felt a cold nose and a soft muzzle rub against his fingers.
"If he recovers, we'll take the god who isn't to the High Foreman as proof of what I said was true. Our people will see that they've been used and lied to all these years."
"If he recovers," murmured the softer female voice. "He's hurt really bad, Limbeck. There's that deep gash on the head." Haplo smiled. He had been awake and listening to Limbeck and Jarre speak in the next room for about an hour now. He understood the basic language. Though these beings called themselves Gegs, he recognized the tongue as a derivative of one known on the Old World as Dwarven. Haplo scratched the dog's head. This journey through Deathgate had not started out exactly as planned. The realization that without his ship he was now trapped on this world did not unduly worry him. Somehow, after he'd accomplished his mission, he would find a way back. "I thought I heard something," Jarre said. Jarre entered the room, bringing with her a flood of soft candlelight. The dog growled and started to jump up, but at its master's touch it lay still.
"Limbeck!"
Jarre cried.
"He's dead,"
Limbeck assumed as he hurried into the room. No, he's not." Sinking down beside the bed, Jarre reached out a trembling hand toward Haplo's forehead.
"Look, the wound's healed. Completely. Not even a scar. Oh, Limbeck, maybe you're wrong. Maybe this being truly is a god."
"No," said Haplo. "I was a slave." He spoke slowly, in a low voice, fumbling for words in the thick dwarven tongue. "Once I was as you are now, but my people triumphed over their masters, and I have come to help you do the same." Pitrin's Exile, Mid-Realm. The journey across Pitrin's Exile was easier than Hugh had anticipated. Bane kept up gamely, and when he did tire, he tried very hard not to show it. Alfred, however, kept getting into trouble. The man's feet seemed possessed of a will of their own, and were continually stumbling into non-existent holes. Consequently, they did not make very good time. Hugh did not push them, did not push himself. They were not far from the wooded inlet on the isle's edge, where he kept the ship moored, but he felt an inexplicable reluctance to reach it. That night, as they gathered around the fire, Bane turned to Hugh and asked, "Will you tell me about the elves, Sir Hugh?" "How do you know I have anything to tell?"
Hugh leaned back against a tree and stretched his feet out to the flames. Bane gazed not at the assassin, but at a point somewhere over Hugh's shoulder. His blue eyes lost their focus. "I see a great battle," said Bane dreamily. "I see elves and men fighting and dying. I see defeat and despair, and then I hear men singing, and there's joy." Alfred, flushing red, reached out his hand and smoothed Bane's golden hair. "What have I told you, your Highness?" the Chamberlain gently rebuked. "It is not polite to tell people secrets." He apologized to Hugh. "You must understand, Sir Hugh, His Highness is a clairvoyant, and he has not quite learned how to handle his gift."
"No, never mind," Hugh said casually. "Prince Bane just described the Battle of the Seven Fields."
"You were there," said Bane.
"Yes, and so was nearly every other human male near my age, including your father the king. Is this what you're calling clairvoyance, Alfred?" The boy must have heard the story from his father 100 times.
The expression on Bane's face instantly changed to one of searing pain. Alfred fixed Hugh with an odd, almost pleading look. "I assure you, Sir Hugh, that this gift of His Highness's is quite real. Bane, Sir Hugh does not understand magic, that is all. He is sorry."
"Would you like to hear the story of the Battle of the Seven Fields, your Highness?" Hugh asked quietly.
The prince looked up, eyes shining. "Oh, yes, Sir Hugh."
"It was back when we were ruled by elven overlords," Hugh explained.
He gazed at the smoke curling upward into the darkness.
"They never had to work to keep the clans of the Volcarans and Ulandia from uniting. The clans did that quite well themselves. After a while, the elven overlords simply shut themselves up in their fine castles and stopped opening their windows to take a good look outside at what was really transpiring. When Stefan and Anne managed to unite the clans, the elves finally opened their windows. In flew arrows and spears, and humans with swords scaled their walls. The uprising was swift and well planned. By the time word reached Aristagan, most of the elven overlords had been killed or driven from their homes. The elves assembled their fleet, the greatest ever seen in this world, and under the command of the elven prince Rishan, sailed for Ulandia. Hundreds of thousands of trained elven warriors and their sorcerers confronted a few thousand humans, without our most powerful wizards, for by then the Mysteriarchs had fled to the High Realm. Our people never stood a chance. Hundreds were slaughtered, more taken prisoner. When King Stefan was captured alive, the army surrendered."
Bane cried out in shock. "You must be mistaken, Sir Hugh. Our army won the Battle of the Seven Fields."
"Our army won?" Hugh raised an eyebrow. "No, it wasn't the army who won. It was one woman who beat the elves, a minstrel who was called Ravenlark, for her skin was black as a raven's feather, and her voice was like that of a lark singing to welcome the dawn. She, along with the rest of the humans, were being herded over a road that ran through the Seven Fields, a road littered with the bodies of the dead. The prisoners were a pitiful lot, for they knew the fate that awaited them, slavery, and envied those that had died. And then Ravenlark began to sing. It was an old song, one everyone remembers from childhood. It's called Hand of Flame. From the sound of the first few notes, the elves stood transfixed, and at Stefan's command the prisoners marched away as fast as their feet could carry them. When the elves came to their senses, King Stefan's spies reported that they were like men awakened from a beautiful dream who longed to go back to sleep. They returned to their ships. Once there, they freed their human slaves and limped home." "The beginning of the Elven Revolution," Alfred interjected. "Supposedly so," Hugh said. "The Elf King proclaimed his son, Prince Rishan, a disgrace and an outlaw, and drove him into exile. Rishan's still stirring up trouble throughout the Elven land." "And with him, they say, travels the minstrel woman," added Alfred softly. "Together they sing the song, and wherever they go they find more followers." Hugh stared into the flames. 10 years have passed, and the Tribus Empire is as strong as ever.
The rebellion has at least kept them from crushing us beneath their boot heels, stated Alfred, wrapping himself in blankets. Now, Your Highness, you should be going to sleep. We have a long day ahead of us tomorrow. Yes, Alfred. Bane ran to get his blanket from his pack. If it's all right, I'm going to sleep here tonight, he said. Looking up at Hugh shyly, he spread his blanket out next to the assassin's. "That's the path to your ship, isn't it?" cried Bane, dancing around Alfred in excitement. The path led in only one direction, through a treacherous thicket overgrown with brambles and crystal trees whose brittle, razor-sharp branches, if broken off, could become lethal missiles in a strong wind. The prince bolted down the path before Hugh could answer his question. "Oh, sir, shouldn't we stop him?" queried Alfred anxiously. The wind whipped around them, shrieking and moaning. Leaves swirled at their feet, and the crystal tree branches swayed above their heads. Hugh peered through the dust at the boy running headlong down the path.
"He'll be all right. The ship's not far from here. He can't mistake the trail."
"If you don't mind, sir, His Highness is my responsibility." Alfred was edging away. "I'll just hurry after."
"Go ahead," Hugh waved him on.
Alfred bobbed his head in servile thanks. His hands flapping at his sides, he loped down the path after the prince. The sound of the crack split the air like an explosion, but a shrill, agonized scream abruptly cut off informed Hugh of what had really happened. He felt an overwhelming sense of relief. "Help! Help!" Alfred's voice could barely be heard over the wind. "A tree! Fallen! My prince!" There was no need for haste. Even if Bane were still alive, he wouldn't be for long. Rounding a bend in the path, Hugh saw that a huge limb from one of the crystal trees had cracked in the wind and come down. Bane was sitting squarely on the spot where the branch must have fallen. He was surrounded by sharp, deadly shards, and there was blood on his shirt. The boy, who should have been dead, was merely rubbing his head and staring at his chamberlain with a puzzled expression. Hugh was completely perplexed, and he didn't like the feeling, any more than he liked the feeling of relief that had come over him when he thought he didn't have to kill the prince. He didn't like any of this. That branch had fallen on Bane as surely as rain fell from the sky. The prince should be dead. What in hell was going on? None of them looked at each other as they continued silently on down the path. The dragon's head was painted black, with flaring red eyes and white teeth. It was about the size of a real dragon's head, for Hugh's was a small ship, meant for sailing within the mid-realm only. As the three travelers drew near the ship, both Bane and Alfred were unable to take their eyes off it. Sleek and graceful, the dragon's neck, topped with a spiky mane, curved back to meet the hull of the ship that was the dragon's body. The sun of late afternoon sparkled off glittering black scales and glinted in the red eyes. "It looks like a real dragon," Bane sighed. "Only more powerful." "It should look like a real dragon, Your Highness," said Alfred, an unusual stern note in his voice. "It was made from the skin of real dragons, and the wings are the wings of real dragons, slaughtered by the elves." Hugh hurried them forward. "Come on. I want to leave tonight, and there's a lot of work to do first." "What makes it stay up in the air?" asked Bane. "Magic," Alfred said. Hugh felt a small hand fasten onto his. "I can't believe I'm really going to get to fly in one of these. You know, Sir Hugh," Bane added with a wistful cheerfulness, "once I've flown in a dragon ship, I will have done everything in life I ever wanted to do. I really think I could die quite contentedly after this." A constricting pain in Hugh's chest nearly suffocated him. He couldn't breathe. Fear gripped him, fear that the child had found out. He turned to look hard at the boy, but Bane was gazing up at him with innocent affection. Hugh jerked his hand roughly out of the child's grasp. "Alfred, get over here and take care of His Highness. I've got work to do." Hugh shoved past Bane without another word. The ship, Dragonwing, sliced through the pearly, dove-colored night, its wings gliding on the magic and the air currents that swept upward over the floating isles. Strapped into the flight harness, snug in the small steerage room, Hugh leaned back and relaxed, letting the dragon ship almost fly itself. The weather was calm, the flying easy, and Hugh had the leisure and opportunity to think. He was making up his mind not to kill the child. He had never before defaulted on a contract, and he needed to satisfy himself that his reasoning was valid and not swayed by sentiment. Sentiment. Though Hugh had reason to sympathize with Bane, who, like him, had apparently suffered through a bleak and loveless childhood, the assassin had grown too callous to feel his own pain, much less that of another. He was letting the kid live simply because Bane was going to be worth more to him alive. Hugh did not have his plans quite worked out. He needed more time to wring the truth from Alfred, time to unravel the mysteries around the prince. He had a hideout, which he used when he needed his ship repaired. He would go there and wait until he had his information. Then he would either return and confront Stefan with his knowledge and demand more money, or perhaps contact the Queen and discover what she would pay to have her son back. Whatever his decision, Hugh figured his fortune was made. 3 days passed. They flew nights and hid during the day on small, uncharted isles. It would take a week to reach Hugh's hideout. Every night Bane sat with Hugh, watching him handle the ship and asking questions. Hugh either answered or did not, depending on his mood. Attachments brought nothing but pain and sorrow. The boy was cold hard cash. That was all. The 4th night, Bane came up to the steerageway and stood staring out the window at the magnificent sight of cloud and vast empty sky below. "Alfred says dinner will be ready soon." Hugh grunted noncommittally. Standing on tiptoe, Bane peered down beneath the dragon. "I can see great dark clouds way, way below us, whirling around and around. That's the maelstrom, isn't it?" Hugh saw no need to reply to the obvious. "I think I heard Alfred calling," Bane said. "It must be time for supper." Bane left, returning a few minutes later with a bowl, which he handed to Hugh. Hugh took a mouthful and choked, spitting it out. "Damn! What did Alfred do? Spill the pepper pot into this stuff?" "I told him it was too spicy." Hugh handed over the bowl of uneaten food. "Take that gunk back and feed it to Alfred." Bane didn't leave the steerageway. Fingers toying with his feathered amulet, he stood watching Hugh with a strange, calm expectancy. "What is it?" Hugh snapped. But at that very moment, he knew. The pepper had masked poison. Cramps clenched his bowels. A burning sensation spread through his body. Objects in his sight elongated, then flattened. The boy grew huge, leaning over him with a sweet, charming smile, the feather dangling in his hand. Rage surged through Hugh, but not as strongly as the poison. Sagging backward, his vision darkening, Hugh heard the boy's odd voice coming from a great distance. "It worked, Father. He's dying," Bane said into his amulet, and he threw the bowl of poisoned food out the window. Hugh crashed to the deck, dragging the cables attached to the harness on his body with him. The ship listed sharply, slamming Bane into the bulkhead. Staggering to his feet, Bane glanced hastily outside and saw the nose of the dragon pointing straight down. Hugh's fall had pulled the wings in, and the magic kept the ship aloft only when they were extended. The ship was plummeting down toward the maelstrom. Beneath them, the maelstrom swirled and boiled, its black clouds with frothy white fringes lit purple by the incessant lightning. It had not occurred to Bane that this would happen. Nor had it apparently occurred to his father. That was not surprising. A human mysteriarch of the 7th house had no need to understand things mechanical. Bane's father, Sinistrad, had probably never even seen an elven dragon ship. "Sir Hugh," Alfred called, "what's happening? We're falling." His gaze rested on the man's body. "Blessed Sartan!" With unusual ease, Alfred dashed in through the hatch, made his way over the coils of rope, and knelt beside Hugh. The chamberlain was no longer the buffoon. His eyes were suddenly strangely compelling and intense. "He got what he deserved,"
Bane said sullenly. "He was an assassin hired by King Stephen to kill me. I've killed him first." "You?" Alfred's gaze went to the feather. "Or your father?" Bane looked confused. His hand clenched around the amulet as if to hide it. He was about to say something, but Alfred beat him to it. "No need to lie," Alfred said. "I've known for a long time, longer than your father and mother, or should I say your adopted father and mother." "What kind of poison did you give him, Bane?" Alfred demanded, reaching out to grasp hold of the boy and shake the information out of him if need be. The prince darted away, slipping and sliding across the slanting deck out of the steerage way. When Bane reached the outside deck, the ship lurched and he was thrown overboard. The prince plunged down toward the center of the maelstrom. "Sir Hugh?" Alfred's anxious face floated above him. "Sir Hugh? Oh, praise the Sartan! You're all right. How do you feel, sir?" With Alfred's help, Hugh sat up. "What happened?" he asked, shaking his head to clear it. He felt no pain, only a kind of grogginess. "He poisoned me." His eyes narrowed. "I was dying." "Oh, no, Sir Hugh. I know it might feel that way, but—" Hugh leaned forward. Catching hold of Alfred by the collar, Hugh stared deep into his light-colored eyes. "I was dead." Hugh tightened his grip. "You brought me back to life." "Sir Hugh, the ship!" Alfred said. "We're falling." Now that his attention was called to it, Hugh could feel the ship rolling. He let Alfred go. Another mystery, but it wouldn't be solved by tumbling into the maelstrom. Hugh struggled to his feet. A glance out the window showed him that they were in no immediate danger of falling. He could easily regain complete control if he moved fast. Then he noticed Bane's small figure falling with the ship. Bane tumbled through the air. He was about to let out a howl of terror when a voice commanded him to be silent. As always, Bane heard the voice in his mind. All his short life, Bane had striven to please the man who spoke to him through the amulet, the man who was his true father. To win the powerful wizard's approval was his dearest wish. "You have the ability to save yourself, Bane. Shut your eyes," Sinistrad commanded. Bane did so. "Now we are going to work the magic. Think to yourself that you are lighter than the air. Your bones are hollow, like a bird's." It seemed impossible, but generations of wizards long dead, plus the boy's own inherent skill and intelligence, came to Bane's aid. "My flesh is made of cloud, my blood of fine mist, my bones are hollow and filled with air." A tingling sensation spread through the prince's body. Opening his eyes, Bane saw to his delight that he was no longer falling. Bane gazed upward. The dragon ship was still falling. Bane relaxed, floating in the air, and waited for it to come to him. "The prince! He's safe!" Alfred exclaimed. "Safe?" Hugh thought the man had gone mad. Still groggy, he made his way across the treacherously shifting deck to Alfred, who stood looking out the window. Looking down on the sky below the ship, Hugh could not repress a low whistle of amazement. "His father's a mysteriarch in the high realms," said Alfred. "I suppose he taught the boy to fly." "They communicate through the amulet," said Hugh. "Yes." "I'm supposed to rescue him, I suppose. A kid who tried to poison me, a kid who wrecked my ship." "After all, sir," replied Alfred, "you did agree to murder him. For money." They were nearing the maelstrom. Hugh should have been trying to rig the cables so that he could extend the wings of the dragon ship and regain the upper air before the storm winds could prevent the ship from rising. "Take that spur and hold it out to the prince," Hugh ordered Alfred. "I'll try to maneuver the ship closer. We're risking our lives doing this." "Yes, Sir Hugh." Alfred ran to get the spar. Hugh stood staring at the mess in the steerage. Finding the ropes he needed, he untangled them and cut them loose from the harness with his sword and wound them around his arms. He had seen men suffer broken bones doing this. Seating himself and bracing his feet against the deck, Hugh began to pay out the lines slowly. The wing began to lift and the magic to activate, but the cable on Hugh's right arm remained limp. It had snapped.
Hugh abandoned the broken cable and concentrated on flying the ship with one wing.
"Nearer!" Alfred shouted. "A little more to the left. Or is it starboard? I can never remember. There, I've almost got him now. Hang on tightly, Your Highness."
Hugh heard the prince's shrill voice yammering excitedly about something, and the sound of small boots hitting the deck. Then he heard Alfred's voice, low and reproaching, and Bane's defensive whine. Suddenly the ship dropped, plunging downward so fast that it seemed their bodies went with it, but their stomachs and bowels stayed up above. Hugh hoped both Alfred and the kid had found something to hang on to, but there was nothing he could do if they hadn't. Grimly, Hugh paid out the line as far as it would go, opening the one wing all the way. Although he couldn't use it to steer, at least its magic would help cushion their fall when they hit the ground, if the maelstrom didn't rip them apart first. Drevlin, Low Realm. Bane was the first to regain consciousness. Opening his eyes, he looked around at the dragon ship and its other 2 occupants. Hugh lay on the deck amidst the cables, his eyes closed, his hands on one of the ropes. Alfred lay sprawled on his back. The chamberlain did not appear to be injured. Then Bane saw Hugh's sword lying on the deck, and the child had a thought. "I could kill them both now," he said, gripping the feather amulet tightly.
"No,"
Sinistrad's answer startled him.
"You need them to bring you to me. But first, I want you to perform a task. I plan to come to Drevlin myself when I acquire a ship. There is a great machine on this isle that very much intrigues me. It was built long ago by the Sartan, but no one has ever been able to discover its purpose. I want you to investigate the machine and find out what you can about these Gegs. I must understand those I intend to conquer. You must watch and learn for me, my son."
The voice faded. Hugh began to groan and stir, and Bane rushed to his side. Hugh eased himself up painfully. He was absolutely astonished to discover he was alive. "You saved our lives," Bane told him, gazing on Hugh with limpid blue eyes. "And after I tried to kill you. I'm sorry, I truly am." The chamberlain sat up, looking around him in confusion. "Where are we?"
"My guess is we're in the Low Realm," Hugh replied.
"Can I go outside?" asked Bane.
"Yes. See if you can find any signs of a Geg settlement."
"Is that wise, sir?" Alfred watched with concern as the voice slid through a hole smashed in the hull.
"He won't go far," Hugh said. "No, while he's gone, tell me the truth."
Alfred shifted uncomfortably and began. 10 cycles ago, a beautiful baby boy was born to Stephen and Anne. A boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes and ears. Anne, you see, has a nick in her left ear on the outer curve. Anne's child had a notch. I saw it myself when they brought the babe out for the showing." Alfred's voice lowered. "The child found in the cradle the next morning did not."
"A changeling," commented Hugh. "Surely they knew."
"Yes, they knew. We all knew. We questioned everyone in the palace, but no one knew how the switch was made. By this, and by other tokens, Trian judged the child had been placed there by magic."
"Other tokens?"
Hugh asked. "The baby had a powerful enchantment woven around him. Anyone who looked at him must immediately love him. Stephen and Anne knew the danger of taking this child as their own, but they, all of us, were helpless to prevent it. That's why they named him Bane."
"And what was the danger?" Hugh asked.
A year later, on the birthday of Anne's true child, a mysteriarch from the High Realm came among us. Sinistrad, an evil man, came to do honor to the little prince, or so he said. He had brought the child a present. When Sinistrad lifted the babe in his arms, we all knew whose child Bane truly was. No one could do a thing, of course, not against a powerful wizard of the 7th house. Trian himself is one of the most skilled wizards in the kingdom, and he's only 3rd house. No, we had to watch with smiles plastered on our faces as the mysteriarch slipped that feather amulet around the baby's neck. Sinistrad congratulated Stephen on his heir and left. His emphasis on that word sent shivers of horror through all of us.
But Stefan was helpless to do anything except dote on the child. Then something happened that made it urgent for Stefan to rid himself of the changeling. The Chamberlain motioned Hugh nearer and whispered, "Anne is with child."
"Ah," Hugh noted. "And so they decided to get rid of one heir. What about the enchantment?"
Trian broke it. 10 years of study it had taken him, but he managed at last. Now Stefan was able to... Alfred halted, stammering in confusion. To
hire an assassin to kill Bane. How long have you known?"
"From the first. It was why I followed you."
"And you would have tried to stop me?"
I'm not certain." Alfred's brow furrowed. I don't know." A dark seed fell into Hugh's mind and took root. It grew fast, twisting around his brain, flowering and bearing a noxious fruit.
"I decided to break the contract. Why? Because the boy is more valuable alive than dead. I never before broke a contract, though there were times when I could have made 10 times the fee paid me. Why now? I risked my own life to rescue the bastard. What if the enchantment isn't broken? What if Bane has been manipulating all of us all along, beginning with King Stefan?"
Darrell Longshoreman, the High Froman of Drevlin, was having a sad time of it. Nothing was going right. First, instead of neatly getting rid of Mad Limbeck, the gods had actually had the audacity to send him back alive. Not only that, but they came with him. Well, one of them did, a god who called himself Haplo. Darrell was being plagued by gods. Gods rained down on his defenseless head. The High Froman was now standing before a wrecked dragon ship that had plummeted out of the skies. Several coppers and the head clerk were behind him. The High Froman was momentarily at a loss. He'd never spoken to a god before. He was just opening his mouth to pay homage to the god when he emerged from the ship. The god was tall and dark, and carried in his hand a weapon of bright, glittering steel. At the sight of this formidable creature, the head clerk, forgetting completely about church protocol, turned and fled. Most of the coppers, seeing the church abandoning the field, figured doom had descended and took to their heels.
"Humph! Good riddance," muttered Darrell. He bowed. "Your worship," said the High Froman humbly, "we welcome you to our realm. Have you come for the judgment?"
The god stared at him, then turned around and spoke to another god who had appeared behind him in what seemed a meaningless babble to the High Froman. And it occurred to the High Froman that these gods hadn't understood a word he'd said. In that instant, he realized that Mad Limbeck wasn't mad after all. These weren't gods. Gods would have understood him. Disillusioned and angry, the High Froman turned his back on the gods and started to walk away. "Wait," came a voice. "Where are you going?" Darrell whirled around. Never in his life had he seen such a beautiful being. Bright golden hair, bright blue eyes. The god glistened like the shining metal of the Kixie-Winzy. This god was a child. "Greetings. I am Prince Bane," said the child in excellent but halting Geg, sounding almost as if he were being prompted. He tightly clutched a feathered amulet in one hand and held out the other, palm open, in the gay ritual gesture of friendship. Darrell Longshoreman drew in a deep, shivering breath. Mad Limbeck is wrong.
"Greetings, Prince Bane," returned the High Froman. "Have you come to pass judgment on us at last?"
The child's eyelids flickered. Then he said coolly, "Yes, I have come to judge you. Where is your king?"
"I am the High Froman, your worship, ruler of my people. It would be a great honor if you would deign to visit our city, your worship."
After glancing back at his two companions, whom Darrell now took for the god's servants or guards, Prince Bane indicated he was ready to travel, and glanced about for the conveyance.
Sorry, your worship, muttered the High Froman, flushing warmly. But we have to, walk. Oh, that's all right, said the god, and jumped gleefully into a puddle. The Gegs led their newly discovered gods through the streets of Wombe, streets that ran up, under, and straight through the Kixie-Winsie. News of the coming of the gods had apparently preceded them. Thousands of Gegs lined the halls and corridors of the machine. Some were cheering with enthusiasm, but others appeared to be angry. Hugh was not awed by many things, but he was awed by the great machine. It flashed and sparkled. It whumped and thwanged. Hugh was also interested in Prince Bane, and what he was doing up ahead in close confab with the ruffled Geg leader. He felt a tug on his sleeve. "Sir," said Alfred, "have you noticed what the crowd is yelling?" "You understand it, Alfred?" "I thought it was prudent to conceal my knowledge of Geg from the prince," Alfred said quietly. "What are the crowd saying?" The chamberlain glanced around at the cheering and occasionally jeering Gegs. "Some are calling out, 'Down with the Froman's god,' and 'We want Limbeck's god.'" "Limbeck? What does that mean?" "It's a Geg name, I believe, sir. If I might make a suggestion, I think there might be another human such as ourselves down here." "Odds are they've got a ship we can use to get out of here. We've got to see this Limbeck and his god or whatever." "That shouldn't be difficult, sir. Not if our little god commands it." "Our little god?" asked Hugh, looking to the prince, who was walking some distance ahead of them. "I think that the Gegs believe Prince Bane is a Manga, one of their gods who has come to judge them worthy of a trip to heaven. According to their legends, the Mangers built the great machine." "Mangers? Who are these Mangers?" "The Sartan." "Devil take us," Hugh swore. "You mean they think this kid is one of the Sartan?" "It would seem so, sir." "Great, just great. And what do you think they'll do when they find out he's an impostor?" "I couldn't say, sir. Ordinarily the Gegs are peaceful, gentle people. But then I don't suppose they've ever had anyone pretend to be one of their gods before." Jari had some business to attend to at WUP headquarters. When she arrived there, she found it empty, except for Haplo and his dog. "The High Froman's come up with his own god," she told him. "I might have expected something like this from him. Well, it won't work, that's all." "Is this god a Welf?" Haplo asked. "I don't know. Most of our people have never seen a Welf. I don't suppose anyone knows what they look like. This god is a human child, and he's been telling everyone he's come to judge us, and he's going to do so at a rally tonight in Wombe and prove that WUP is wrong. Of course, you can deal with him." "Of course," murmured Haplo. Jari was bustling about. "I've got to find Limbeck. We've got to make plans for tonight." She threw a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. Left alone, Haplo threw himself in a chair. The dog, sensing his master's mood, thrust his muzzle comfortingly into the man's hand. "The Sartan, do you think, boy?" mused Haplo, absently scratching the dog beneath the chin. "And what do I do if it is? I can't challenge this god and reveal to him my own powers. The Sartan must not be alerted to our escape from their prison, not yet." Drawing back the bandages that swathed his hand, he ran a finger over the blue and red spiderweb lines of the sigla decorating his skin. "I could build a ship in a day. I could show these dwarves power they've never imagined. I could become a god to them, lead them to war against the humans and the Welves. No." Haplo angrily jerked the cloth back over his hand. "That is my patron nature speaking. I must move slowly. The Gegs are not ready, and one of their own should lead them. Limbeck. Somehow I must blow on the spark that is Limbeck. As for this child god, there's nothing to be done but wait and see. But if it is a Sartan," muttered Haplo, leaning back in the small, uncomfortable chair,
May my lord keep me from ripping out the bastard's heart.
That night, 2 guide gigs, Limbeck, Jarre, Haplo, and of course the dog, entered and navigated through a series of winding tunnels below the Kixie-Winzy. They were on their way to the factory, to capture the being who called himself a god and prove that he wasn't one. Unfortunately, the tunnels were not deserted, and they ran into large numbers of gigs. The sight of Haplo and Limbeck created excitement, and almost all the gigs who didn't have other, more pressing business decided to follow along. Soon a parade of gigs was tromping through the tunnels, heading for the factory. So much for secrecy and surprise. Haplo comforted himself with the knowledge that the noise of the Kixie-Winzy drowned out the sound of their advance. "Here we are," shouted a guide gig, pointing to a metal ladder leading up a shaft, at the top of which was a metal plate that covered a hole in the floor of the factory. Haplo volunteered to go up first and scout out the situation. When he reached the top of the ladder, he cautiously pushed the plate and peered out. Directly in his line of vision stood a tall statue of a robed and hooded figure. Lounging around the statue were 3 people, 2 men and a child. They were human. But the Sartan were also of human derivation. The child suddenly stood up in front of the statue, obviously intrigued by the eyeball in its hand. "No, Your Highness!" But the stumble-footed man moved too late. The boy touched the eyeball. To his delight, it flickered with a bright light. "Look," Bane said. "Look, it's a map!" Keenly interested in the statue himself, Haplo took advantage of the trio's preoccupation and crept out of the hole. The 3 were intent on the eyeball. Haplo, coming up silently behind them, recognized the images flitting across the eye's surface as a map of the realm of the sky, a map remarkably like one his lord had discovered in the halls of the Sartan in the Nexus. At the very top were the isles known as the Lords of Night. Under the Lords of Night floated the Isle of the High Realm, beneath which was the firmament. Then came the Mid-Realm. Further down were the Maelstrom and the Land of the Gigs. Most remarkable, the map moved. The isles drifted around in their oblique orbits, and the storm clouds swirled. Then, suddenly, all the isles and continents lined up neatly in a row, those of one realm positioning themselves directly beneath those of the realm above. Then the light flickered and went out. There came a low whirring sound, and suddenly the picture started over again. Alfred, whom Haplo took to be some sort of servant, started to reach for the statue's hand, as if to stop the pictures. "Please don't do that," Haplo said quietly. Hugh whirled, sword drawn, and faced the intruder with an agility and skill that Haplo inwardly applauded. Haplo stood with his hands up, palms outward. "I'm not armed," he said to Hugh. Haplo wasn't the least afraid of the man's sword, but he had to avoid the fight at all cost. Of all of them, it was the child who intrigued Haplo. When Haplo looked at the boy, he felt the runes on his chest sting, and he knew that an enchantment was being cast at him. "Where did you come from? Who are you?" demanded Hugh. "My name is Haplo. My Geg friends and I must talk to you. Are the High Froman's guards around?" Hugh lowered the sword slightly. "No, they left, but we're probably being watched." "No doubt. Then we haven't much time before someone returns." Limbeck, puffing and panting from his scramble up the ladder, trotted up behind Haplo. The Geg glanced askance at Hugh's sword, but his curiosity was stronger than his fear. Jarre followed close behind. The 2 Geg guides cautiously poked their heads up out of the hole. "I'll tell you the truth," said Hugh. "The kid's no more a god than you are." Hugh had reached the same conclusion about Haplo that Haplo had reached about Hugh. They both remained wary, but crowded inns forced people to sleep with odd bedfellows or spend the night out in the cold. "Our ship got caught in the maelstrom and crashed on Drevlin not far from here," Hugh said. "The gigs found us and thought we were gods, and we had to play along." Haplo glanced at the person he thought was a servant. "Who's that?" "The kid's chamberlain, Alfred. I'm called Hugh the Hand. The kid's name is Bane, son of King Stefan of the Volcarans and Ulandia."
Haplo turned to Limbeck and Jare, who was observing the three with great suspicion, and made introductions.
"You're not a god, then?"
Limbeck asked Bane.
"No," Bane answered. "I'm really a prince of the High Realm. My father's a powerful wizard."
Behind his spectacles, the Geg's eyes grew wide. Alfred gazed with deepening curiosity on Haplo's wrapped hands.
"Are you injured, sir?" he asked respectfully. "Forgive me for asking, but I notice the bandages you wear. I'm somewhat skilled in healing."
"I'm not wounded," Haplo replied curtly, then more gently. "It's a skin disease common to my people. It's not contagious, and it doesn't cause me any pain, but it's not pleasant to look at." "You're stranded down here?" Hugh asked him. Haplo nodded. Jare didn't like the two tall, strong gods that weren't putting their heads together and talking in a language she couldn't understand. She slipped back over to the hole.
"Bring everybody up," she called down softly. "It's time to capture the sham gods."
The patron glanced over and saw the Geg streaming up out of the hole. Hugh, hearing a sound at his back, looked in the opposite direction, toward the main entrance of the factory.
"Company," said Hugh. "The High Froman and his guards. Alfred, take the kid and go with... No, dammit, don't faint!"
Hugh reached out, but it was too late. The Chamberlain slid down gracelessly across the feet of the Manger statue. Jare stood near the hole, helping Geggs climb out, rallying her people to attack. The High Froman, instantly recognizing his danger, ordered the coppers to rush the Geggs. Shouting wildly, the two groups came together. For the first time in the history of Drevlin, blows were struck, blood was shed. When the last Geg had come up out of the tunnels, Jare looked around and discovered she had completely lost sight of Limbeck, Haplo, and the three strange beings. Leaping onto the top of a crate, Jare peered over the milling, fighting press of Geggs and saw, to her horror, the High Froman and the head clerk standing near the statue of the Manger, taking advantage of the confusion to spirit away not only the gods, but also the august leader of Wup. Furious, Jare jumped from her crate and ran toward them, but got caught up in the midst of the battle. Pushing and shoving, she struggled to get near the statue. When she finally reached her destination, they were gone. The gods were gone. Limbeck was gone. The High Froman had won. Doubling her fist, Jare was prepared to punch the head of the first copper who came near her when she heard a moan, and looking down, saw two large feet sticking up in the air. They weren't Geg feet. They were god feet. Jare was amazed to see that the doors at the base of the statue of the Manger were wide open. One of the Froman's gods, the tall, gawky one, had apparently fallen into this opening and was lying half in and half out of it. Hurrying over to the god, she saw that he was lying on a staircase that led inside the statue and to the tunnels below, providing them with a quick and easy means of escape. The captives were locked up in the local prison. The High Froman made an announcement he reckoned would strike terror into their hearts.
"I'm turning you all over to the Wells," said Darrell Longshoreman with dark satisfaction.
It was a decision he had come to in the factory as he gloomily surveyed the bloody battlefield. It hadn't, in reality, been much of a battle. The aforesaid blood had flowed from a few smashed noses. No one had been killed. The age-old habit of living peacefully was hard to break, but the High Froman was wise enough to know that this was only the beginning. Convinced that all of the so-called gods, including the child, were only posing as such, he was determined to be rid of them. If his decree did strike terror, the prisoners gave no outward sign. Hugh appeared disdainful, Bane bored, and Haplo impassive, while Limbeck was in such a misery of guilt that it was doubtful if he heard the High Froman at all. Getting no response from his prisoners, the High Froman marched out in high dudgeon. "I presume you know what he's talking about?" inquired Haplo, "about being given to the Wells."
"Elves," corrected Hugh. "Once a month the elves come down in a transport ship and pick up a supply of water. This time they'll pick us up with it. And we don't want to end up prisoners of the elves. Not if they catch us down here with their precious water supply. Those bastards can make dying very unpleasant."
Limbeck sat huddled in a corner in the far end of the cell, his shoulders slumped. The child was talking at him. The Geg seemed completely oblivious. Haplo made an almost imperceptible sign with his wrapped hand. The dog, who rarely took his eyes from his master, immediately trotted over to Limbeck and gave the Geg's hand a swipe with his tongue. Haplo could now hear every word of the conversation between Bane and Limbeck quite clearly. "You can't give up," said the boy. "Not now. The fight's just beginning."
"But I never meant there to be a fight," protested poor Limbeck. "Gangs attacking each other. It's all my fault."
"Oh, stop whining," said Bane. The boy fell suddenly silent, as if someone had bidden him to hold his tongue. Haplo saw Bane take the feather amulet in his hand. When he spoke again, Bane's voice had changed. "I've got an idea, Limbeck," said the prince. "When we leave this place, you can go with us. You'll see how well the elves and the humans live up above while you Gegs slave down here below. You'll get to see the truth."
"The truth?"
repeated Limbeck. "A remarkable child. A dangerous one," said Haplo to himself. The Geg stroked the dog, who lay still beneath his hands. "That's it," Limbeck said. "When the Welves come, I'll know just what to do." "What?" asked Bane eagerly. "I'll make a speech." Later that evening, Hugh called a meeting.
"We don't want to end up prisoners of the elves," explained the assassin. "We've got to fight and try to get away. And we can if you Gegs will help us."
Limbeck wasn't listening. He was composing.
"Welves and whoops, ladies and gentle... No, too many was."
"The Gegs are untrained, undisciplined," Haplo objected. "They don't have any weapons. And even if they could get weapons, we don't dare trust them. It'd be like sending in an army of children. Ordinary children," he added, seeing Bane bristle. "When Father and I return," Bane announced, "we're going to whip the Gegs into shape. We'll take on the elves and we'll win. And we'll control all the water in the world. And we'll have power and be rich beyond belief."
"What about the Gegs?" suggested Haplo.
"Oh, we'll take care of them," answered Bane. "They'll have to fight."
"Fight?"
repeated Hugh, interrupting Bane in mid-dictatorship.
"Why are we talking about fighting? How are you at singing?" he asked Haplo.
At midnight, as the others lay asleep, a whispering voice woke Hugh and Haplo. "Sir Hugh?" A white face pressed against the opposite side of the grillwork on the wall nearest them, which covered a hole that opened into the tunnels.
"How did he find us?" Haplo muttered. "Alfred has a wide range of talents," remarked Hugh. "Who's that with you?" he asked Alfred.
"It's Jarre, Limbeck's wife."
"The grill's bolted fast on this side, Alfred," Hugh said. "Can you work any of the bolts out from yours?"
"I'll see, sir. It's rather difficult, without any light. Perhaps if I used my feet, sir, and kicked."
"Good idea." Haplo backed out of the way. "It's about time his feet were good for something," said Hugh.
Hugh heard a thud and saw the grillwork shiver slightly. 2 more kicks, a groan from Alfred, and the grillwork popped off. By now, Limbeck and Bane were both awake and had come over to investigate. First Alfred, then Jarre emerged. She raced to Limbeck and threw her arms around him. "Oh, my dear," she said in a fierce whisper. "The news singers say the High Froman's going to turn you over to the Welves. Don't worry. We're going to get you out of here now." "Guess what, Alfred?" interrupted Bane. "We're going to fight the elves."
"We're not going to have to escape, Jarre," Limbeck explained. "I'm going to make a speech to the Welves and ask for their help and cooperation. Then the Welves will fly us to the realms above."
"You're not going to fight anyone, are you?" Jarre asked Limbeck.
"No, my dear," said Limbeck. "We're going to sing."
"Sing?" Jarre was astonished. "Are the Welves fond of music?"
"What did she say?" Hugh demanded. "Alfred, we've got to get this plan moving. Come here and translate for me. I have to teach her that song before morning."
"Very well, sir," said Alfred. "I assume, sir, you are referring to the song of the Battle of the 7 Fields."
"Yes,
The gigs'll have to learn to sing it in human. Tell Jerry not to worry about what the words mean. It shouldn't be too difficult for them to learn." Alfred translated Hugh's order into Gag.
"Oh, Limbeck," Jerry was biting her lip. "Are you sure you should go up there? I don't think you should leave us. What will Wup do without you?"
"I'm going, Jerry, and I'm counting on you and our people to help. And when I come back, when I've seen the truth, then we'll start the revolution." Jerry recognized his stubborn tone, knew it was hopeless to argue, and anyway, part of her was stirred by what Limbeck was doing. This was the true beginning of the revolution.
"I'll do it," Jerry said.
"You can teach her the song now, sir," said Alfred. With Alfred translating, Hugh gave Jerry his instructions, taught her the song, then bundled her back into the air-shaft. Before she left, Limbeck took Jerry's hand. "Thank you, my dear. This will be for the best. I know it."
"Yes, I know it too," Jerry replied a little sadly.
She gave Limbeck a shy kiss on the cheek, then hastily turned and climbed back down through the air-shaft. Bane yawned.
"I think I'll just lie down again, Alfred."
"Allow me to straighten your blankets, Your Highness." Alfred cast a swift sidelong glance over to Hugh and Haplo, who were pounding the grill shut.
"Your Highness."
Alfred lowered his voice, keeping his eyes fixed on the blanket that he was, as usual, clumsily twisting and knotting rather than straightening. "When you look at that man, Haplo, what can you see with your special vision?" Alfred saw cunning in Bane's eyes, which was swiftly masked by the bright gloss of innocence. "Why do you ask, Alfred?" "Just out of curiosity, Your Highness. Nothing more." Bane leaned over to Alfred and said softly,
"I don't see anything. I've only met one other person who's the same, you, Alfred. What do you make of that?"
The blanket suddenly seemed to spread itself out smooth and flat. "You can lie down now, Your Highness." Bane smiled sweetly and closed his eyes. The smile remained on his lips. He was enjoying some private joke. The Chamberlain watched Haplo lie down, give the dog a pat, and saw the dog lie protectively at the man's side. "I have to find out. I must know for certain. Then my mind will be at rest. I can laugh at my fears, or prepare to face them." Of all the constructions of the Sartan, the lift-alofts were the most impressive, mysterious, and inexplicable. 9 gigantic arms made of brass and steel thrust up out of the corallite in an open area outside the city of Wombe. Atop each arm was an enormous hand. All but one of the hands, however, drooped lifelessly. The working hand was spread flat, palm up, forming a platform. Its arm was hollow, and a golden door at its base allowed entrance. Hundreds of stairs inside led to the palm. At prearranged intervals, the High Froman and the head clerk and such other gigs deemed worthy would gather on the palm to greet the whelves and receive their payment for services rendered. The payment, which was known as mana, was all the rubbish accumulated throughout the elven lands. Gigs would venture out into the raging storm and gather around the base of the arms to wait for the mana to fall from heaven. This morning's ceremony was particularly well attended. The High Froman, expecting trouble, was considerably disconcerted when there wasn't any. The crowd that hastened across the corallite in a break during one of the storms was quiet and orderly. Too quiet, thought the High Froman. Beside him marched the head clerk, his face a picture of self-righteous indignation. Behind him were the gods who weren't, and the troublemaker Limbeck, all taking their punishment rather well, considering. The coppers marched behind the prisoners, followed by Jarre and the Wups. Hidden beneath the Wups' cloaks and shawls were a smattering of toots, and here and there a wheezy wail, known to humans as bagpipes. When the High Froman reached the golden door at the base of the arm, he formally accepted from the head clerk a large key, nearly as big as his hand, which he used to open the door. "Bring the prisoners!" he called, and the coppers herded everyone forward. The High Froman, the head clerk,
Several of the High Froman's personal guard and the prisoners crowded into the lift aloft. At the last moment, Limbeck halted in the door, turned, and scanned the crowd earnestly. Jare, blinking back tears, raised one hand in loving farewell. Beneath her cloak, she clutched her weapon, a tambourine. Captain Zancorel, a member of the royal family and captain of the elven ship Carfachon, had a great personal regard for himself, and none at all for those who had the distinct misfortune not to be him.
"Captain,"
said Lieutenant Botharin. "Lieutenant?" His salutation was always spoken with a slight sneer.
"We are nearing the docks."
"Thank you, Lieutenant, but I'm not blind, nor am I as stupid as perhaps was your last late captain." The lieutenant stiffened. He turned away from the window. "What do you make of it, Lieutenant?" inquired the captain.
"Trouble. I've served on this run a number of years, and I've never heard of humans being found on the low realm. I might suggest that we do not dock until we find out what's going on."
This perfectly logical suggestion would mean discussion with the Geigs, and Zancorel couldn't speak Geig. The lieutenant could. Captain Zancorel immediately came to the conclusion that this was just another trick of the lieutenant's to make a mockery of him. "I didn't know you were quite so afraid of humans, Lieutenant," responded the captain. "I cannot have a frightened man at my side going into what might be a dangerous situation. Report to your quarters, Lieutenant Botharin, and remain there for the duration of the voyage." Stunned silence settled over the bridge. A charge of cowardice leveled against an elven officer was tantamount to a death sentence. The lieutenant could denounce the captain before the military tribunal, but the captain was a member of the royal family. Whom would the judges believe?
"As you command, sir."
The lieutenant left the bridge. The captain addressed his wizard in a bland voice, as if nothing were amiss. "We're facing an encounter with humans, Magica. I assume that all aboard have been issued whistles?"
"Yes, Captain."
"Very well. Make contact with the Geigs," Zancorel said. The ship's wizard, bowing swiftly, picked up a magically enhanced speaking cone that projected voices from the dragon's open mouth. Lips to the cone, the wizard shouted out something in the uncouth language of the Geigs. From down below came a great squawking bellow. The Geigs were answering. The elven wizard listened and replied. He faced the captain. The elf captain had regained his good humor. "Human prisoners! What's more, prisoners who have obviously been attempting to sabotage our water supply. What a valuable find! I shall be decorated for this. Inform the Geigs we will be happy to comply." "Here they come!" The head clerk chattered excitedly. "Here they come!" The hatch opened, and the gangway slid out from the bulwarks and was fixed firmly to the fingertips of the palm. Zancorel emerged. Moving down the gangway, the elf appeared enormous in his ornately decorated iron suit. "Damn!" swore Hugh beneath his breath. "What is it?" Haplo leaned near. "He's wearing a whistle around his neck. Their wizards created it. Supposedly, when the elves blow into it, the sound it makes can magically negate the effects of the song." "Which means that the elves will fight." "Yes," Hugh hissed. "And we have nothing to fight with except our bare hands." The High Froman was ordering the coppers to bring the gods. The coppers started toward Limbeck, who firmly elbowed them out of the way. Stepping forward, he drew in a deep breath. "Distinguished visitors from another realm, it gives me—" "Shut him up!" shouted the High Froman. The coppers surged forward and grabbed Limbeck by the arms. "Start singing," Haplo whispered to Hugh. "I've got an idea." Hugh began to boom out the song. At the first note, the Geigs below let out a cheer and began to sing with all their might. Singing, they rushed the coppers at the door in the base of the arm and raced up the stairs. The elven captain grasped his whistle and put it to his lips. Haplo touched the dog lightly on the head, made a sweeping gesture with his hand, and pointed at the elf. "Take him." By the time the elf captain saw the dog, it was airborne, heading straight toward him. Encased in the clumsy armor, the elf could not react fast enough. The dog hit him square in the chest, and Zancorel toppled over backward like a felled tree. Haplo moved in, with Hugh not far behind. There was no song on Haplo's lips. The assassin was singing loudly enough for both of them. "Whoops, unite!" shouted Limbeck, shaking off the annoying coppers. Immersed in his speech, he paid no attention to the chaos around him. The first gig surged through the door at the top of the arm and dashed out onto the golden palm. The elf captain, flat on his back on the gangway, struggled with the dog. Reaching the gangway, Haplo knelt swiftly at Zankorel's side. Haplo took the elf's sword and tossed it to Hugh. Sword in hand, Hugh dashed up the gangway and through the hatch, singing as he ran. "Dog, here, to me!" Haplo called. The dog bounded from the chest of the ironclad elf, leaving him floundering on his back. Haplo managed to dart back down the gangway to extricate Bane, Alfred, and the speech-making Limbeck from the thick of the crowd, and hustled them toward the ship, leaving behind the Wupps and the High Froman's minions tangled together in battle. When Haplo reached the ship's deck, he saw Hugh facing an elf with a sword in his hand. Behind the elf ranged the rest of the ship's crew, armed and waiting. No one spoke. Hugh had quit singing. He watched the elf narrowly, waiting for the attack. "We mean you no harm," said Hugh in Elven. The lieutenant raised a delicate eyebrow, glanced around at his armed crew, who greatly outnumbered the intruders. "No kidding. We've been stranded down here," Hugh continued. "We want to escape. We're bound for the High Realm." The elf sneered. "You're lying, human. The High Realm is banned, ringed around by magical protection." "Not to us," said Hugh. "This child," he pointed at Bane, "is the son of a Mysteriarch." "How came such a child to be in your care?" The elf was looking at Bane thoughtfully. Bane returned the elf's gaze and smiled sweetly, bravely. The lieutenant was charmed. From outside came a clunking and clattering of iron. "The whistles! Use the whistles, you fools!" yelled the elf captain, who had managed to make his way back to the hatchway. Only 2 whistles screeched. "Do as I command! Damn you, Lieutenant!" The lieutenant's hand moved and grasped his whistle. He gave the thong on which it hung a vicious jerk, broke it, and hurled it to the deck. There was ragged cheering among the elven crew, and many followed their lieutenant's example. The captain's face flushed crimson with rage. "Traitors! Traitors led by a coward!" Hugh had only a vague idea what was going on. Apparently they'd stumbled across some sort of private feud among the elves. "Get me out of this thing!" The elf captain could not move in the iron suit. His wizard lay a hand upon the armor and spoke a word. The iron melted away. Bounding forward, the elf captain put his hand to his side, only to discover his sword was gone. He found it almost immediately. Hugh was pointing it at his throat. "No, human," cried the lieutenant, moving to block Hugh. "This is my battle. Captain, you have called me a coward. Now you can no longer hide behind your rank." "You say that very bravely, Lieutenant, considering that you are armed and I am not." The lieutenant turned to Hugh. "As you can see, human, this is an affair of honor. I am told you humans understand such things. I ask that you give the captain his sword. That leaves you weaponless, of course, but you don't have much chance anyway. If I live, I pledge myself to assist you." Hugh considered the odds, then, shrugging, handed over the sword. The 2 elves squared off. Haplo had his own worries. He had been keeping his eye on the riot raging outside the ship, and saw that the Wupps, having defeated the coppers, were searching for trouble. Should the Wupps board the ship, the elves would think it was an all-out attack, forget their own differences, and fight back. Sword clashed against sword. The captain and lieutenant thrust and parried. Haplo swiftly made his way over to the hatch. He found the mechanism for raising and lowering the gangway. Haplo released the mechanism and pulled on the ropes, drawing up the gangway as swiftly as possible. Haplo turned from the hatch in time to see the lieutenant thrust his sword through the elf captain's body. The lieutenant yanked his weapon free, and the captain slid to the deck. The crew was silent, neither cheering nor lamenting. Reaching down, the lieutenant picked up the dead elf's sword, and turning, handed it, hilt first, to Hugh. "Thank you, human," the lieutenant said. "What you said about the High Realm, is that true?" "Yes," Hugh replied. "We were attempting to reach the High Realm when my ship was damaged and fell into the maelstrom." "Your ship? Humans do not fly dragon ships." "Humans named Hugh the Hand fly what they please." The elven crew murmured, and the lieutenant nodded.
I see. If you will excuse me, humans, I have duties to perform now that I am captain of this vessel. You will be shown to your quarters.
Castle Sinister, High Realm. Iredal stood at the casement, gazing out the crystal window at a sight of incomparable beauty. The opal walls of her castle glistened in the sunlight, adding to the shimmering colors of the magical dome that was the High Realm's sky. Its beauty could stop the heart, but it had been years since Iredal had seen beauty in anything. "Wife," the voice came from behind her. Iredal shivered. Fearfully she turned around and faced him. "What do you want?"
"Our son is coming at last," Sinistrad said.
"Our son," Iredal cried. "Your son. He is none of mine."
"I'm glad you take this view of the matter, my dear," said Sinistrad with a thin smile. "I trust you will not interfere with our work. Good day to you, wife. I will give you notice when you are to appear to greet our son."
Sinistrad left Iredal's chambers. Shivering uncontrollably, the woman crouched in her chair and stared out the window with dry, burning eyes. She remembered back to the day her son was born. Sounds outside the window roused Iredal from her reverie. Sinistrad was mounting his quicksilver dragon. The beast was huge, larger than the castle, with silver skin, a sinuous body, and red eyes. Having sighted the elven ship, Sinistrad was on his way to the Wizards' Guild Hall to finalize his plans. He could have transported himself mentally to the Guild Hall, dissolving his body and reforming it when the mind arrived at its destination. That had been his means of entry into the Mid-Realm, but such a feat was taxing, and besides, the Mysteriarch was fond of using the dragon to impress the other wizards. None of the others had been able to exert a hold over the highly intelligent and dangerous Quicksilver. If it slipped its magical leash, it would kill everyone in its path. It would not hurt, in this critical time, to remind his colleagues once again why they had chosen him to be their leader. Swift as its name, the Quicksilver Dragon bore Sinistrad away to New Hope, the capital city of the High Realm. Sinistrad arrived there to find that the magic had already been cast in preparation for the return of his son. Shining crystal, towering spires, tree-lined boulevards, he barely recognized the place. He quickly passed through the glittering crystal doors of the guild hall. Inside the hall, talking in solemn and hushed voices, were gathered about 50 wizards. When Sinistrad strode into the room, those present fell silent. Nodding to friends here, noting enemies there, Sinistrad moved slowly through the large hall. Like any other race, the human wizards had their own version of history. Following the Sundering, the Sartan had brought all of the humans to the High Realm to live beneath a magical dome. The humans, especially the human wizards, had worked extremely hard to make the High Realm not only habitable but beautiful. It seemed to them that the Sartan were never around to help, but were always off somewhere on important business. On their infrequent returns, the Sartan lent their assistance, utilizing their rune magic. Thus it was that fabulous buildings were created, coralite bore fruit, and water was in abundance. The human wizards were not particularly grateful. They were envious. They coveted the rune magic. Then came the day when the Sartan announced the mid-realm below was suitable for habitation. Humans and elves were transported to the mid-realm, while the Sartan remained above in the high realm. The human wizards believed that the Sartan had cast them out because the wizards were becoming too knowledgeable about the rune magic. Time passed, and the elves grew strong and united under their own powerful wizards. The human wizards watched the rise of the elves with outward disdain and inward fear. They said to themselves, "If only we had the rune magic, then we could destroy the elves." Instead of helping other humans, the wizards began to concentrate their magic on finding ways to return to the High Realm and discover at last the secrets of the runes. At length they succeeded, and a large force of the most powerful Mysteriarchs ascended to the High Realm. The humans called this the War of Ascension, only it wasn't much of a war. The Mysteriarchs found the Sartan gone, their cities abandoned. The runes kept their secrets, and the Mysteriarchs discovered to their horror how much of the beauty and bounty of the land had depended on the runes. Famine swept the land. Water became scarce. Most horrifying, it became obvious to the Mysteriarchs that the magic of the dome was fading. How could they leave the High Realm without proclaiming their failure, their weaknesses? One man had an idea. One man told them how it could be done. The Mysteriarchs were desperate, and they listened. Having arrived at the front of the Guildhall, Sinistrad now addressed his fellows. "The elf ship has been sighted. My son is aboard, in accordance with our plans." "We never agreed to allow an elven vessel inside the dome," spoke out a female Mysteriarch. "They will be intimidated by the sight of our illusions," said Sinistrad, gesturing toward the outside of the Guildhall. "We will have no trouble from them." "Why not meet them at the firmament? Take your son and let them go on their way," demanded an aged Mysteriarch. "Because, you doddering fool, we need their vessel," Sinistrad hissed, clearly growing angry at the questioning. "With it we can transport large numbers of our people back down to the mid-realm." "So what do we do with the elves?" asked the woman. Everyone looked to Sinistrad. They knew the answer. He said it without pause, without hesitation. "We kill them." The silence was loud and echoing. "Unless there are any who disagree." The Mysteriarch cast a swift, searching glance around the room, weaving a web and tugging it tighter and tighter. No one managed to break free. Deep Sky, Mid-Realm. For weeks the elven ship Carfashan had sailed higher and higher, drawing near the firmament that spanned the sky like a monstrous radiant necklace. The air had grown colder, and chunks of ice floated in the air around them. As supplies ran out, and the cold grew almost unbearable, the elven crew muttered among themselves that this was mad folly, that they would all perish. On this day, weeks after their journey had begun, Captain Botharin had decided to tell his guests that he had changed his mind, that the ship was returning to the mid-realm. Everyone had assembled on the bridge, and he was just about to make his announcement when a crewman called him. "What is it?" the captain asked. "Have we found the High Realm?" "I'd say, sir," said the stammering midshipman, staring out the porthole, "that it's found us." Sinistrad was an imposing presence. He wore a black, gilt-edged skull cap that dipped to a sharp point at the bridge of his nose and lent expression to a face that, lacking eyebrows and eyelashes, might otherwise have had none. Hugh, however, thought he could see the glint beneath the lashless eyelids as the Mysteriarch, graciousness itself, cordially offered, "The journey might be the tiniest bit difficult, Captain, but not impossible. I will show you safe passage through the firmament." He glanced around the bridge. "Surely you will not refuse your crew the chance to view the wonders of our realm." "Very well," Botharin said. A cheer from the crew died out with the flash from the captain's eye. "May I ride with you on the dragon, Papa?" asked Bane. "Of course, my son." The High Realm. Guided by the Mysteriarch on his quicksilver dragon, the Carfashan sailed through the ice floes and through the magical dome surrounding the High Realm. Elves, humans, and the Geig pressed their faces against the portholes, staring out at the marvelous world below them. Within seconds they had left behind a world of frozen, glittering ice, and entered a sun-warmed green land with a shimmering, rainbow-hued sky. On landing in New Hope, the ship was greeted by Sinistrad and Bane. The Mysteriarch called up to the captain that he hoped the crew would disembark and take in the pleasures of their city. "Thank you," Botharin shouted down.
Some of my officers and I may later be pleased to accept your invitation. As for now, we have work to do."
Sinistrad said nothing. He merely bowed in acquiescence.
"You will have no objection, I hope, sir, to my taking your passengers to meet my wife, and to stay as my guests in my house? We are most beholden to them."
Captain Botharin replied that he was certain his passengers would enjoy escaping the routine shipboard life. The Quicksilver Dragon carried the humans and the gig to Sinistrad's dwelling. The castle seemed to float on a cloud, and commanded, whenever the mists parted, a view of the city of New Hope that was spectacular. Inside the castle, they stood in the enormous entry hall. Hugh noticed a woman descending the stairs.
"Ah, there you are, my dear," Sinistrad said.
The woman froze, staring at her child. Bane kept very near Sinistrad, clinging tightly to the wizard's hand. Hugh saw that the woman was about to fall. Racing up the stairs, Hugh caught her in his arms. "So that's Mother?" said Bane.
"Yes, my son," remarked Sinistrad. "Gentlemen, my wife Iridal." He waved a negligent hand at her motionless body. "I must apologize for her. She is weak, very weak. And now, sirs, if you will follow me, I will show you to your quarters." "What about her, your wife?" Hugh demanded. He smelled the fragrance of crushed and faded lavender. "Take her to her room," said Sinistrad. "It's at the top of the stairs." Hugh entered her room and laid Iridal gently upon her bed. She was younger than he had guessed at first. Her hair was white, but it was thick and as finely spun as gossamer. Iridal stirred and woke. She looked up at Hugh, and fear contorted her features. "Go now," she whispered. "You're in terrible danger." Her eyes. Hugh was mesmerized by her eyes. They were large and deep-set, the irises every color of the rainbow. "What danger?" The woman shook her head frenziedly. "No, I've said enough. His eyes and ears are everywhere." It had been a long time since Hugh had felt another's pain. It had been a long time since he'd felt his own. Deep inside him, memories and feelings that had been lying dead came to life. Hugh, with a final glance at the stricken woman, thought it best to do as she said, for the moment at least. Spread out on Sinistrad's desk were the drawings his son had done of the great Kixie Whinsey. The drawings were quite good and remarkably accurate. Sinistrad had instructed the boy on how to use magic to enhance his work. The wizard was studying the diagrams when a muffled bark caused him to raise his head. Bane was roughhousing with the dog. Sinistrad turned back to the drawings. "What was it originally designed to do?" he puzzled.
"I know what it was meant to do," Bane said excitedly, moving to his father's side. "And I know how we can rule the entire world. I figured it out while I was making the drawings." Sinistrad indicated the drawings with a negligent wave of his hand.
"Show me."
The dog, forgotten, plopped itself down at the wizard's feet. Tinkling bells called Sinistrad's guests to dinner. A long oaken table, covered with dust, stood in the bleak dining room surrounded by cloth-draped chairs resembling guardian ghosts. The guests gathered within the room, most of them ill at ease, to await the arrival of their host. Haplo ran his fingers through the dust. "I can hardly wait," he remarked, "to taste the food." Lights flared above them. The dust vanished. The empty table was suddenly laden with food and drink. Music began to play softly.
"Please sit down," said Sinistrad, waving one hand.
With the other he led in Iridal. Bane walked at his father's side. Escorting his wife to the end of the table, he seated her in a chair.
"To reward Sir Hugh for his exertions in caring for you today, wife, I will place him at your right hand."
Iridal flushed and kept her gaze on her plate. Hugh sat where he was told, and did not appear displeased.
"The rest of you may find chairs where you will, except for Limbeck. My dear sir, please forgive me.
Switching to the Geg's language, the wizard made a graceful bow. I have been inconsiderate, forgetting that you do not speak human. My son has been telling me of your gallant struggle to free your people from oppression. Pray, take a seat near me and tell me of it yourself. Do not worry about the other guests. My wife will entertain them. Sinistrad took his seat at the head of the table. Flattered, Limbeck plunked his stout body into a chair at Sinistrad's right. Bane sat across from him on his father's left. Alfred hastened to secure a seat beside the prince. Haplo chose the seat himself at the opposite end of the long table, near Iredell and Hugh. The dog plopped down on the floor beside Bane. Sinistrad turned to Limbeck. This Kixie-Winsie of yours fascinates me. I plan to journey down to your realm and take a look at it. Of course, I will also be quite pleased to do what I can to help your people prepare for the war. War? Limbeck's cry echoed in the hall. My dear Geg, I didn't mean to shock you. Sinistrad smiled at him kindly. War being the next logical step, I simply assumed that you had come here for this very purpose, to ask my support. At the other end of the table, Iredell, keeping her eyes on her husband, addressed Hugh. I hope you will forgive my indisposition this afternoon. You weren't sick, Hugh returned. You were scared as hell. You must forget what I said. As you value your life, do not mention it again. My life is of very little value. Hugh caught her hand underneath the table, except as it can be used to serve you. Iredell pulled her hand away. She sat silently, staring at her plate. Then she raised her eyes and looked at her son. Tears filled her eyes. Swiftly she lowered her head. Haplo watched Hugh clench his fist in pain and anger. How had love's gilt-edged knife managed to penetrate a heart as tough as that one? Haplo didn't know, and he didn't care. All he knew was that it was damned inconvenient. Haplo needed a man of action, since he was barred from action himself. Iredell, Hugh began under his breath, I can't bear to see you suffer. Why should you care about me? She retorted bitterly. I'm damned if I know. You or your son. Some wine. Haplo poured a glassful and shoved it toward Hugh. The goblet's base struck the man's fingers, and wine sloshed on his hand. What the devil? Hugh turned on Haplo angrily. Haplo raised an eyebrow, obliquely nodding his head in the direction of the opposite end of the table. Attracted by the commotion, everyone, including Sinistrad, was staring at them. Iredell's face was cold as the marble walls. Hugh lifted the goblet and drank deeply. Frowning, the Mysteriarch continued with his conversation. Almost immediately, Hugh's head slumped forward and hit the table with a thud. Iredell sprang from her chair, crying out in alarm. Haplo was on his feet and moving. It's nothing, he said, reaching Hugh's side. Slipping the assassin's flaccid arm around his neck, Haplo lifted the heavy body from the chair. Good man, but a weak head for wine. He's been celebrating all day. I'll take him to his room. Haplo got Hugh to his feet. Weaving drunkenly, the man was just barely able to stagger toward the door. Haplo found Hugh's room and soon eased Hugh onto his bed. The assassin wouldn't wake up from Haplo's spell until morning. Haplo retired to his own room. He needed to think, to assimilate all that he had heard today. The Kixie-Winsie. Even before he heard Bane's explanation, Haplo had deduced the great machine's function from the flickering images portrayed on the eyeball held in the hand of the Manger in the factory. When had the Sartan discovered their mistake? When had they found out that the world they had created was imperfect? When did they realize that the beautiful floating islands in the sky were dry and barren and could not nurture life? The Sartan would have fixed it. They had built a machine that, with the aid of their magic, could align the isles and the continents. Closing his eyes, Haplo saw the pictures again clearly. A tremendous force beaming up from the Kixie-Winsie catches hold of the continents and the isles, drags them through the skies, and aligns them, one right above the other. A geyser of water, drawn from the constant storm, shoots upward continually, bringing the life-giving substance to everyone. Haplo was rather surprised that Bane had also solved the puzzle. When Bane told Sinistrad, the Mysteriarch had, most obligingly, explained how he, with one flick of the Kixie-Winsy switch, intended to rule a realigned world. What criminal folly, Haplo thought, to build something this powerful and then walk away and leave it to fall into the hands of some ambitious Mysteriarch. Why had the Sartan done it? For all their faults, they weren't fools. Something must have happened to them before they could finish their project. This was the clearest sign that the Sartan were no longer in this world. Alfred finally found his bedroom after a rather prolonged search through the corridors of the palace. Alone at last, he pondered his dilemma. Limbeck is falling under the sway of the Mysteriarch. I can see the bloody conflict into which the Giggs will be drawn. I should stop it, but how? And then there is Haplo. What can I do? Why was I left by myself? And in his bedroom, Bane lay rigid in his bed, his father's words resounding in his mind. Stop arguing with me, Bane. You must return to the Mid-Realm and take your place on the throne. Of course, I will be the one who is truly ruling the Mid-Realm, but I can't be in two places at once. I will be on the Low Realm preparing the machine, Bane thought. Yes, and where would you be now, Papa, if I hadn't shown you how? You lied to me, Papa. You told me we'd be together always. The boy grasped hold of his feathered amulet and jerked hard. It would not break. Finally, he managed to squeeze his head through the chain. Bane hurled the amulet into the corner of the room. No one loves me, and I'm glad of it. I hate all of them. I'll kill them all. The following morning, Sinistrad and Bane were seated at Sinistrad's writing desk, poring over the drawings. The dog lay at Bane's feet. Father, said Bane, one day I saw Trian drawing something that looked like a letter of the alphabet on a sheet of paper, but wasn't. When I asked him about it, he crumpled it up. He said it was magic, and I mustn't bother him about it. Bane innocently returned the Mysteriarch's sharp-eyed, curious gaze. The dog sat up. What did the symbol look like? Sinistrad asked. On the back of one of the drawings, Bane traced a rune. That? Sinistrad snorted. That is a sigil used in rune magic. This Trian must be more of a fool than I thought to be dabbling in that arcane magic. Why? Because only the Sartan were skilled in the use of runes. Bane smiled and petted the dog, who gratefully licked his fingers. The effects of Haplo's spell were slow to wear off. Hugh could not distinguish between dream and reality. He thought he remembered Sinistrad speaking to him by his bedside. I could use a man of your talents. Stefan and Anne must be dealt with. My son must sit on the throne. A clever man like you could figure out how their death could be accomplished. I've work to do, but I'll return later. Remain here and think about it. Here was a dank cell that had been created out of nothing and nowhere. I'll stay here until I die or until I call Sinistrad master. I've served many men. What's one more? Or better yet, maybe I'll just stay where I am. This cell isn't much different from my life. A cold, bleak, and empty prison. I built the walls myself, made them out of money. Sir? Hugh started. Híredal? Was she real, or was she only a trick of his throbbing mind? Sinistrad plans to take my son away from me again. Híredal spoke softly. She stood in front of him. She trusted him. The door of the prison he himself had created swung slowly open, sunlight flooding into his soul. Híredal, do you know what your husband's really plotting? That changeling is going back as king. King? That's impossible. They already have a king. Not impossible, madam. Your husband's planning to hire me to get rid of their king and queen, and then Bane, their son, will inherit the throne. You're wrong. He's never taken a life. He couldn't do such a thing. Iredell, I'm a murderer. Worse, I've murdered for money. I don't believe you. You're lying. Iredell, there is someone you can trust. Alfred's a good man. He's devoted to your son. If you want to escape, he could take you to the elven ship. Escape? Iredell glanced frantically around the cell walls. It was not Hugh's cell walls she saw, but her own. She too is a prisoner, Hugh thought. I opened her cell door, and now she sees it swinging shut. Iredell stared at him, started to speak. Then, shaking her head, she shut her eyes and, in an instant, was gone. Limbeck sat at a desk in his room, finally ready to put pen to paper. "My people," he began. Outside Limbeck's room, in the corridors of the castle, Haplo wandered, idly wasting time, or so it seemed. He was, in fact, keeping account of everyone as best he could.
"Alfred, I want to have a talk with you."
It was Bane's voice, coming to Haplo through the dog.
"Certainly, Your Highness. Alfred, I know you're a Sartan."
Haplo came to a dead stop. Alfred felt the world slide out beneath his feet. The ceiling of his room seemed to be collapsing, and he thought for an awful, blessed moment that he might faint. But this time his brain refused to shut down. This time he would have to face the peril. The child was enjoying this immensely. And there was the dog, its head raised, watching him as if it understood every word. The dog! Of course it was understanding every word, and so was its master. "Come, Alfred," said Bane, regarding him with smug self-assurance. "You remember the time when the tree fell on me? I was dead. I knew I was dead because I was floating away, and I looked back and saw my body lying on the ground. But suddenly I woke up, and on my chest was this." Bane held up the piece of paper. "My father said it was a rune." "Deny it. Laugh lightly," Alfred thought. "And then there was Hugh," Bane continued. "I know that I gave him enough poison to kill him. He was dead, just like me. You brought him back to life." "Come now, Your Highness," Alfred stammered. "And now that I know that you're a Sartan, Alfred, you've got to help me kill my father." Bane reached into his tunic, pulled out a dagger. "Look, I found this in my father's desk. Sinistrad's going to fix the Kixie-Winsy, and then he'll control the water supply." "I cannot help you, Your Highness. I cannot take a life." "Oh, but you'll have to. If you don't, I'll tell my father who you are, and he'll try to use you himself. He'll try to kill you if you don't obey him. Then you'll have to fight, and you'll win, because you're stronger." "No, Your Highness. I will die. We are not immortal, something I think we forgot." It was despair that had killed the Sartan. The despair he was feeling now, a great and overwhelming sadness. They had dared to think and act as gods, and had ceased to listen to the true gods. Things had gone wrong, and they had realized, finally, that they had tampered with what should have been left undisturbed. "I will die," repeated Alfred. The dog came over to him and laid its head on his knee. "And what is your master thinking, knowing that his ancient enemy is within his grasp?" The Chamberlain smiled, much to Bane's frustration. Alfred gently thrust aside the dog. He walked to the center of the room, lifted his arms, and began to trace runes in the air and draw them on the floor with his feet, moving in a solemn and graceful dance. "Alfred, what are you doing?" "I am leaving, Your Highness," said Alfred. The air around him began to shimmer as his dancing continued. Bane grabbed at Alfred, and there was a crackle. The magical wall the Sartan had built around himself singed the child's fingers. "You can't leave me! I won't let you!" Bane wailed. "Your enchantment doesn't work on me, Bane," Alfred said sadly, his body fading away. "It never did." A large, furry shape bounded past Bane through the shimmering shell and landed lightly at Alfred's side, catching his ankle in its mouth. Alfred's body stopped fading and began to regain its solidity. The door to the room burst open. "So you are going to leave us behind, eh, Sartan?" inquired Haplo. "Just like the old days." Haplo had long imagined his fury upon meeting a Sartan, but now even he could not believe its strength. It was suddenly hard to breathe. He gasped for air. "Just like you jailers left us to die in the labyrinth." "The jailer didn't leave," Alfred said. "The jailer died. Your people have been trapped in that prison all this time?" "Yes, but you knew that already. That was your intent." "That was never our intent," Alfred answered. "You must believe that. You must believe that we didn't know you were still there." "You're coming with me," said Haplo. "I'm going to take you back to see for yourself the hell your people created." "No, I won't go with you." The Sartan shook his head. "Then I'll use force. I'll enjoy that." "I've no doubt. But if you're trying to conceal your presence in this world," Alfred's gaze fixed on the bandaged hands, "then you know that a fight between us, a duel of that magnitude and magical ferocity, could not be hidden, and would be disastrous to you." "Look here, Alfred," Bane burst out impatiently. "None of us are going anywhere as long as my father's alive." Neither of the two men answered him or even looked at him. "I don't need you," Bane cried. "I'll do it myself." He stalked out of the room, and the dog padded slowly after him. Limbeck, hearing nothing of what was happening 2 doors down, continued writing. "We have been lied to, my people. They told us that they were gods and we had to work for them, that they would reward us by bringing us up to heaven. But they never intended to make good that promise. And so, in conclusion—" Limbeck paused, his hand trembled, his eyes misted over. "My people," Limbeck slowly wrote the words, "we are going to war." Sinistrad and Hugh were seated in the Mysteriarch's study. Outside, coiled around the castle, dozing in the sun, was the Quicksilver Dragon. "Let us see, what would be best?" Sinistrad tapped the desk with his thin fingers. "We will transport the child back to the Volcarans on the Elven ship. Then, when Stefan and And are discovered dead, it will be blamed on elves. You can make it appear that the elves murdered them." The air around Hugh stirred, and icy fingers seemed to touch his shoulder. Iredell was working her own magic against her husband. She was there, invisible to all. She was listening. "Sure, nothing's easier," Hugh said, doing his best to seem at ease. Now that she was faced with inescapable truth, what would she do? Iredell felt nothing at hearing Sinistrad plot murder. Her mind, her senses, had gone numb. "Ah, here you are, Father." Bane entered the study, coolly ignoring Sinistrad's glare. "Bane, I'm busy. Leave us," said Sinistrad. "No, Father. I know what you're talking about. Don't make me go back, Father." The child's voice was suddenly sweet and soft. "I want to be with you." Sinistrad rose to his feet. His robes rustled around him as he moved out from behind his desk to confront his son. "Bah! You will do what I tell you to do. Now leave us. I will send for you later." Sinistrad turned his back on the child. Bane, a strange smile on his lips, thrust his hand into his tunic. "I guess you won't be my father for long, then." "How dare you!" Sinistrad whirled around and saw the dagger in the child's hand. The Mysteriarch raised his right hand to cast the spell that would dissolve the child's body where he stood. "I can get more sons," he shouted. The dog leapt, hit Bane square in the back, and knocked the child to the floor. The dagger flew from the boy's hands. Something unseen struck Sinistrad. Invisible hands clutched at his. Raging, he grappled with his wife, whose spell crumbled as she fought, revealing her to her husband. Hugh was on his feet. He snatched up his dagger from the floor. He'd free her child. Hugh struck, driving the dagger deep into the wizard's back. Sinistrad screamed in fury and in pain. The assassin jerked his dagger free. The body of the Mysteriarch shimmered and faded, and Hugh thought his foe was dead. Suddenly there sprang up an enormous snake. The wizard had returned. The snake's head darted at Hugh. Too late, the assassin drove his knife again into the reptilian body. The snake had already sunk its fangs into Hugh's neck. The assassin cried in agony, the poison surging through his body. He managed to retain his grip on the knife, and the snake, twisting and coiling, drove the blade deeper. It lashed out in its death throes, wrapped its tail around the assassin's legs, and both crashed to the floor. The snake disappeared. Sinistrad lay dead, his legs wrapped around the feet of his killer. Hugh tried to rise, but he had no strength left. "Hugh!" Iridel called. Weakly he turned his head. It was pitch dark in his cell, but there was a crack in the wall. A thin shaft of light gleamed brightly. He could smell fresh air, perfumed with the scent of lavender. Slipping his hand through the crack, Hugh held it out to her. Reaching out as far as she could through her own walls, Iridel touched his fingertips. But at that instant, Hugh's soul was set free. A low rumbling sound caused the stones of the palace to quiver on their foundation. It grew louder, shaking the ground. The castle shifted. Limbeck opened his door and looked out. "This is more like home," he shouted gleefully over the rumbling. He walked easily down the trembling floor of the corridor to Alfred's room. He entered, waving a sheaf of papers. "Do you want to hear my speech?" A triumphant howl split the air. "The dragon's free!" exclaimed Alfred. "Something's happened to Sinistrad." The thought of what the beast would do to them was the final straw for Alfred, and he fainted. Haplo could hear through his dog the sounds of the dragon smashing down the walls of Sinistrad's study. Haplo looked down at the unconscious Sartan. "I could make this faint last as long as I need it to last, and transport you to my lord. But I've a better idea. You know where I've gone. You'll come to me of your own accord." Kneeling beside Alfred, he grabbed hold of the Sartan and shook him roughly. "Come out of it, you craven scum." Alfred blinked and groggily sat up. "I fainted, didn't I?" A child's thin wail of terror rose in the air. The dragon's howl cracked solid stone. Haplo pointed in the creature's direction. "You were right. I'm not permitted to fight, not even to save my life. So I guess it's up to you, Sartan. The boy and his mother are still alive. You'd better hurry." Alfred swallowed hard. He rose shakily to his feet, and with a trembling hand traced a sigil on his chest. His body began to fade. "Goodbye, Sartan," called Haplo, "for the time being. Limbeck, are you all right? Can you walk?" My spectacles!" Limbeck picked up the bent frames and poked his fingers through the empty rims. "Don't worry," said Haplo, helping the gig to his feet. "You probably don't want to see where you're going anyway." Iridel had tamed dragons before in her girlhood, but only gentle creatures. The dragon she faced now had always terrified her. The dragon's roarings thundered above her. A fiery red eye peered in at Iridel and the boy. A lightning-like tongue flicked in desire. The woman did not move. Crouched behind his mother, his arm clasped tightly around the dog's neck, Bane stared round-eyed. The dragon couldn't reach them yet. It couldn't get its huge head into the small hole it had created and was forced to rip more blocks from the castle walls. The dog suddenly turned its head, looked over at the door, and whined. Bane followed the dog's gaze and saw Haplo standing next to Limbeck in the doorway, beckoning to him. The dog whimpered, and gripping hold of Bane's tunic in his teeth, attempted to tug the boy toward the door. "Mother!" the boy cried. "Mother? Don't call me that. You're not my child," Iridel said with a strange and dreamlike calm. "When you were born, someone switched the babies. Go along, child. Hide somewhere. I won't let the dragon hurt you." "Bring him!" Haplo shouted. The dog got a grip on the boy's shirt and pulled. Bane saw the dragon thrust a claw through the hole it had created in the ceiling and make a grab for its prey. Stone crashed down. Dust rose, obliterating his mother from his sight. The claw groped, feeling for the warm flesh the dragon could smell. Iredell was trapped in a small area beneath the hole in the ceiling. When the dust cleared and the creature could see, it would have her. Iredell, eyes closed, waited almost impatiently to feel the sharp, searing pain, the talons piercing her flesh. Instead, she felt a gentle hand on her arm. "Don't be afraid, child." Incredulously, she opened her eyes. Bane's servant stood before her. Slowly and gracefully, Alfred began to dance. He raised his voice in a thin, high-pitched chant. His hands, his feet traced unseen sigla. His voice gave them names and power. His mind enhanced them. His body fed them. Burning acid dripped from the dragon's flicking tongue. Snapping jaws dived down, and Iredell shivered in terror, certain the man must be bitten in two. Alfred, looking up, saw his danger, but he merely smiled and nodded almost absent-mindedly, concentrating on his magic. His dance increased in tempo. The chanting grew a little louder. The dragon hesitated. The snapping jaws did not close, but remained poised over their victim. The creature's head swayed slightly, in time to the rhythm of the man's voice, and suddenly the dragon's eyes widened in wonder. Alfred's dance grew slower and slower. The chanting died away, and soon he came to a weary halt and stood gasping for breath, watching the dragon closely. The quicksilver didn't seem to notice him. Its head, thrust through the gaping hole in the castle wall, gazed at something only it could see. Keeping a wary eye on the dragon, Iredell took hold of Alfred's hand and held it fast. "What have you done to it?" "The dragon thinks it is back in its ancient home, a world only it can remember. Now, at least, it is at peace." "And I am free," she said in wonder. "And it isn't too late. There is hope. Bane, my son, Bane!" Iredell ran toward the door where she'd last seen him. The rubble blocked her path. "Mother!" At that moment, the patron lifted his hands, crossed his arms. Fiery runes began to burn in the air, one appearing after another. They formed a circle of flame that completely encompassed patron, Geg, and boy, but did not harm them. "Here, dog." Haplo whistled. The dog, grinning, leapt lightly through the ring of fire to his side. "We are going home." And so, Lord of the Nexus, that is the last I saw of the Sartan. I know you're disappointed, perhaps even angry that I didn't bring him back. But I knew Alfred would never allow me to take the boy or the Geg, and as he said himself, I could not risk fighting him. It seemed to me to be a splendid irony that he should be the one to cover my escape. Alfred will come to us of his own accord, my lord. He can't help himself, now that he knows Death Gate swings open. Yes, my lord, you are correct. He has another incentive, his search for the child. Alfred knows I took the boy. I heard before I left Drevlin that the Sartan and the boy's mother, Iredell, had joined together to look for her son. As for the boy, I think you'll be pleased with Bane, my lord. There is potential in him. Naturally, he was shaken by what happened in the castle, so if you find him quiet and subdued, be patient with him. He is an intelligent boy, and will soon learn to honor you, Lord, as we all do. And now, to finish my story. When I left the castle, I took the boy and the Geg with me to the elven ship. There we discovered that the elf captain and his crew were being held prisoners by the Mysteriarchs. I made a deal with Botharin. In return for his freedom, he would take us back to Drevlin. Once there, he would hand over his ship to me. Botharin had little choice but to agree. Either he accepted my terms, or met death at the hands of the Mysteriarchs, who were desperate to escape their dying realm. I was, of course, forced to use my magic to free us, but I made sure the elves did not see me work my magic. Botharin flew us to the low realm. The gagged Limbeck was greeted by his people as a hero. He has become a powerful leader. He is High Froman of Drevlin now. His first act was to launch an attack against an elven ship that attempted to dock at the lift aloft. In this, he was helped by Captain Botharin and his crew. Botharin told me before he left that he intended to take the ship they had captured to Prince Rishan, leader of the Elven Rebellion. He hopes to form an alliance between the rebel elves and the dwarves against the Tribus Empire. It is rumored that King Stefan of the Ulandia cluster will join them. Whatever the outcome, world war rages, my lord. The way is prepared for your coming. When you choose to enter the realm of the sky, the war-weary people will look upon you as a savior. As you can imagine, my lord, it took me some time to prepare the elven ship for its journey into Deathgate. When I was ready to leave, I sent the boy into a deep slumber and made my way back through Deathgate. This time, I knew the perils I faced and was prepared for them. The ship sustained only minor damage, and I can have it repaired in time for the next journey. That is, my lord, if I have earned the right to be sent on another such mission. Thank you, my lord. Your praise is my greatest reward. And now, I propose a salute. This elven wine is a gift from Captain Botharin. I think you will find its taste extremely interesting, and it seemed to me fitting that we should drink to the success of our next mission. To Deathgate, my lord, and our next destination, the Realm of Fire. This is Tracy Hickman. We hope you have enjoyed this production of Dragonwing by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. This program was produced and directed by Robert Kessler. Abridgment by Scott and Tamara Matthews. Dragonwing is available in paperback wherever books are sold.